all-important manufacturing sector in India. Now, despite witnessing rapid economic growth, India's manufacturing sector share of GDP has remained more or less stagnant over the last 2 decades. Now, even though the Make in India campaign has been reasonably successful in bringing the focus onto the sector, the big question still remains. Can India become a global manufacturing hub?
A very warm welcome to all our viewers for today. Today we have a power-packed panel that will share the views on can India become a global manufacturing hub. In no particular order, we have with us Ramesh, Managing Director, 3M India, Mohan, Managing Director, BASF India. We have Guenter, CEO and Managing Director, Tata Motors. We have Sandeep with us, MD, J&J Medical India. I truly welcome you all to this session and thank you so much for your time today. So before we dive into the session, let me try and give some quick context, from a panel discussion perspective. So the question that we have with us is that, can India become a global manufacturing hub? The Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan lays down the government's clear intent of revamping a strong manufacturing sector for the country's long-term growth in a post-COVID-19 world. While the pandemic has spurred interest in the domestic manufacturing ecosystem, I believe the journey has just begun. India competes with the manufacturing destinations like Thailand and Vietnam, some of whom fare better on the crucial parameters, such as ease of starting a business, on land, on labor laws. And we would discuss this during the session. It seems that some of these bottlenecks in India that may be perhaps responsible for its relatively weaker standing as it compared to its regional peers when companies are assessing offshoring initiatives, alternatives there. When you look at the some of the data with respect to 2018 and 19, there were about 56 companies that moved bases from China. And one would not help to notice that more than 50% of them relocated to Vietnam and 40% plus relocated to Taiwan and Thailand. And out of 56, only 3 companies actually decided to relocate to India. As we progress on the manufacturing journey that the government has intended and the industry is taking on board as well, believe that providing easier access to land, incentivizing innovation and R&D, and also further investment in reskilling efforts may be some of the prerequisites for India to realize its goal of becoming a global manufacturing hub. With this, let me go over to my esteemed panel members and get their views as well on the India's journey towards becoming a global manufacturing hub. So Ramesh and Mohan, starting with Ramesh first, before we get into the India specifics, it might just be helpful for all of our viewers to get a quick perspective from you that if your company was to further expand its manufacturing footprint in Asia for exports, what would be the 3 or 4 crucial drivers that you would like to focus on before deciding on a preferred country? Ramesh, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Neeraj. 3M, we are essentially a material science company. And a lot of what we do is also based on where our customers are and what our customers do, because we supply materials which go into the end product of our customers in most cases. So even if you roll the clock back for a few years and see several years, in fact, and see what happened in Japan, what happened in China, in Japan with the automotive industry or with the electronics industry, a lot of it started manufacturing in Japan to serve our customers in Japan. And then as those customers moved around the world, whether in Asia or Europe or even in the United States, I think our manufacturing facilities, our support followed that. So a lot of our decisions on, and this is also true for China. In China, when 3M invested back in 1983, a lot of our manufacturing in China was directed to customers in China. There could have been global customers who came into China to manufacture there, and then our manufacturing footprint followed what they did. So what I'm essentially saying is in many instances, we follow our customers and expand our footprint in the country. So in the case of India, as we prioritize sectors, we bring in, let's say anchor OEMs, so to speak, or lead OEMs in specific sectors into India. Mobile handheld manufacturing is a great example. Then we would follow it with the necessary manufacturing because we do have a lot of participation in that industry. The other considerations would, of course, be ease of movement in and out of the country for product. IP protection. I mean, these would be availability of skilled labor for sure. Yeah, thanks.
Great. Thanks very much, Ramesh, for that. So Mohan, coming to you, Ramesh focused on the fact that, given the kind of the setup the industry has, So they follow the customers, and if the OEMs are deciding to move in a particular location, that's where the lead would follow for them. Mohan, from your perspective?
Well, BASF being a chemical company and pretty much similar to what Ramesh said, I would build on that because Ramesh happens to be one of my key accounts. In that context, we do supply to the material science business. And that said, automotive happens to be our largest industry as the BASF. So if you look at BASF and its portfolio across our divisions, we more or less cater to the entire industrial production that would happen in an economy. You can start basically with ag, and then you have the automotive, the construction, the paints, materials, appliances, you name it, and there would be some part of BASF in there. And now then I can get into personal care and nutrition and so on. So overall, the industrial framework or the industrial development of an economy is where BASF fits in. Once you have industrial development, you have the manufacturing industries coming in. BASF looks at it as a market. It has a critical mass that makes it attractive for BASF to get into that market. Now, once you have that, the economies of scale, Ramesh mentioned about ease of doing business, getting in and out. You have to be competitive in that economic time frame as well, because most of our chemicals can cross borders, international borders. So if you don't have a competitive manufacturing setup, you mentioned IP protection, you mentioned also skilled workforce. All these things are essential frameworks, hygiene factors, if I may say so. But key to it is you need to be economically competent, you need to have scale, and most important of all, you need to have a value chain where you can play right from oil and gas, which happens to be the starting point, into refineries, into chemicals, and then ending up into all these applications. So having a manufacturing framework and industrial framework which cuts across all these industries is kind of important for BASF. You framed a question initially about exports, and BASF typically looks at markets in the context of where the markets have critical mass, not just in terms of its own customers, but also in terms of consumption. So in that context, having a base load in the market is a strategic pillar for BASF. Yes, incremental exports can always be done because you do need the scale, and with that, export business helps to have scale. But BASF typically doesn't invest across the world thinking about, I do this as an export base only. Yeah, so it looks at it more in the context of industrial development of the economy, and how do I build that and have the economies of scale to then export from there as well.
Thanks, Mohan, for that. So we are looking at follow the customer's customer, in some sense around that area, but that's interesting there. So you did spoke about the fact that that there is a element of not only the some of the prerequisites to be done, but there is also a clear focus to see that in a sense that it has to be globally competitive, from a cost perspective there.
Absolutely.
And that's where the production kind of follow through as well there. So coming to you, Guenter, and when you answer that, just have the frame which Mohan and Ramesh have laid out for relocating a facility as well. But now when we zoom into India, looking at it from an India perspective and also from an auto sector perspective there, there is one part that I tried to say initially, that while India is doing better on the ease of doing business ranking, but on ease of starting a business point of view, we see that Thailand and Vietnam and some of these countries rank higher than us there. And then Ramesh and Mohan added on to say that there are logistics, cost competitiveness as some of the prevalent industrial framework, as one of the key parameters over there. So when you look at that, what are the 3-4 things that come to you in your mind from an auto sector perspective, when you look at, say that both from an industry point of view and the government point of view, that you would like to see to happen more?
Niraj, thanks a lot for your question, but it's possibly not that easy to answer it in a straightforward manner. And I'm afraid, listening to what has already been mentioned by the others, I'm not quite sure if there's any specific to the automotive industry as far as our expectation related to government's focus on India as a global manufacturing hub is concerned. But let me possibly start on a positive note, because we all have recently seen some movements of the governments, business-oriented, sector-specific, but also taxation reforms got introduced in order to accelerate what you have already called out, the ease of being business. With a piece of statistic we're all familiar with, India ranks now 63rd overall in the World Bank's ease of doing business ranking. And it's declared objective of the government to actually get into the top 50. Good news and very encouraging news. That's the reason why we have in particular seen during the lockdown multiple round of podium discussions and special events promoting India, always with the same reference: government is taking action, government is serious. But at the same point of time, as we have seen the improvement from previously 136 spot to the 63rd spot, we still get from lots of businesses which we try to attract to come to India, consistent remarks where they are saying it's easier to do business in India, but the startup is still hard to do. And if you ask what makes the startup so hard, they say it takes significant time. It's a question of cost and effort to glide through the official requirements. There is lots of visible, invisible red tape, and multiple licenses are required. So therefore, on behalf of the automotive industry, but I assume that's also valid for the other industries, also the ones on the podium, we should actually address certain priorities in order to boost manufacturing for the benefit of actually create job opportunities. It's not just about manufacturing for the sake of the same. It's for the sake of actually building jobs in order to actually feed the highly qualified workforce that gets year and year into the market, and where India needs to take care of it in order to really leverage the initial investment in education by taking advantage of the education and the skills and the talent available in the country. Let's just call me out a few ones. We certainly need, and you heard me saying it frequently, we need to have a more collaborative, a more targeted approach amongst all the stakeholders. It's not just government calls, we follow or we demand, government follows. I think we need to have an inclusive approach in order to get us all on the same page and to make sure that we work extremely well orchestrated and focused. The other one is about a seamless alignment and progression from an intention to the on-ground enforcement on all levels of the government. So it's not just good enough to hear the secretaries, the joint secretaries, the ministers, or our prime minister to make the announcements. I think we need to make sure that this message actually travels and gets executed rigorously on all of the levels of the administration. We need to call out the barriers that needs to be reduced, or better to say, to be removed. We need a less number of forms to be filed, less licenses to receive in order to support the ones who get into India with a much more simplified administrative, call it bureaucratic environment. And it would be great to have a single window of clearance to streamline the interactions with the agencies for approval and inspections. To get a little bit more practical, we need quicker timelines, better contract enforcement and quality control with certain safety mechanisms. Because often we get the feedback, could you please help? We don't know where we stand. Is there any opportunity to provide support by your governmental affairs department? So there's actually a request for hand-holding. But is it right that there's a hand-holding requirement? Would it not be better to have very simplified processes where investors can actually walk through the process without being hand-held? I think it could make lots of sense. And in particular, because of the liquidity crunch we have experienced the last 2 years, or starting 2 years ago, and the meanwhile it's about to be eased and relaxed. the availability of quality credits and the related infrastructure is also an important one. Talking about India as a manufacturing hub, so for export opportunities, I think India domestically, but even more so in order to support the international business, needs to streamline its logistics. The percentage of logistic cost of our total cost, as also addressed by the government, saying 15% in average as we see it today, is not competitive. It needs to be streamlined. It needs to be very seamlessly integrated. It needs to be multimodal. We actually need more organization in the logistics sector, from transport to logistics hubs. I think this is something that would need to get utmost priority, in particular when it comes to the access to ports, in order to boost the export opportunities. So it's a long list, but I think if you reduce it, it's possibly a handful bullet points, where if we would actually go for an orchestrated effort, the industry with the government, with an inclusive approach, we can actually take the whole investment environment on top to the ease of doing business to the next level.
Thanks, Ms. Guenter. I think there was a loud focus on simplified processes, and the fact that a strong focus to come on implementation as well. Whatever's been announced, whatever is being done up, is it actually percolating down, and is it getting simplified from an execution perspective there? I think the point that you spoke about contract enforcement, typically that's one of the areas where India lags significantly, given that almost they say by a study that on average it takes about more than 1400 days for a contract enforcement in India, when you compare that with New Zealand of about 200 odd days and China with about 500 odd days there. On a ranking of the enforcement, I think we are at almost 160 plus kind of a ranking there. So that's again an important area to look at. Mohan, if I come to you, given this context, when you look at from a chemical sector perspective, what would be, let's say, 3-4 prerequisites, for India to truly emerge, from a global manufacturing hub perspective, from a chemical sector perspective?
So if you look at the overall chemical sector, I would start by giving credit to a couple of areas in the chemical sector which has done well. So if you look at the knowledge-based life sciences industry, whether it is agrochemicals or pharmaceutical intermediates or formulation manufacturing in the generic space, here India as a country has done well, both in the context of domestic business as well as exports worldwide. Now, how have we done that? We've more or less become part of the global supply chain. We are supplying very heavily into the Americas, into the especially South America. I think is a big market for many of our ag players, and also wherever the non-regulated pharma, we do quite well. Now, why do we do that? Because we have reasonably good people. We have good understanding of those manufacturing processes. They are complex processes, multi-steps, and we manage it extremely well. The right people, the right technologies available, and we have the entrepreneurs who have invested in this over a longer period of time. Now, when you look at that value chain, of both pharma and ag, we are heavily dependent on countries like China or even Western Europe or North America for the intermediates. All the building blocks, they need to come from everywhere. Now, I give that as an example because we always claim we are successful in the space of pharma and ag, but when you now translate that into the entire chemical industry, during the pandemic, we also were exposed because many of these intermediates were simply not available in the country. Yeah. And now if India has to become a global manufacturing hub in the chemical arena as a whole, now we don't have so much oil and gas as natural resources. So obviously the refinery inputs would come from somewhere in like the Middle East, or we would get it from somewhere. But then once you cross the refinery step and get into the chemical space, building up of those value chains, how do we get to the point that you come? I don't see us becoming independent of the world value chain. So you have to be part of the value chain in the world, but there are certain areas where India has a critical mass to set up its own manufacturing hub, and also be part of the export trend, where we have a certain possibility in the context of scale. Now, what we need to do, of course, there is have the right environment around. So if you look at power, we have some of the most expensive power on this planet. Yeah, we talked about logistics costs. Logistics in the chemical framework can absolutely kill you, which is where most successful chemical parks, there are networks built. I mean, if you look at Antwerp, if you look at Jurong Island in Singapore, these are all places where you have an anchor investor with on a particular value chain of chemistry, and then many of the smaller companies around it or mid-sized companies building an entire industrial framework. So I would say it's something where we can do that. We have had success stories, and if we are to build these kind of infrastructures in terms of chemical parks, which has government as well as private participation in the context of infrastructure of how do you manage the environmental topics, the effluent treatment plants, how well they work, what kind of power you have, what kind of logistics frameworks you have, the pipeline networks that you require across these places. So I think that's the kind of environment we need to make sure that, you know, in the chemical space, we are able to tackle these topics.
That's great. So Sandeep, let me come to you. I think the 2 points which Mohan raised as well was, from a right people and right tech perspective, which has helped in the other 2 sectors that he spoke about in terms of the especially on the knowledge-based life sciences part of it there. From your perspective, when you look at the medical industry, from the perspective there, healthcare industry overall. So how do you think the government, industry, and the academia, right, can synergize their efforts to bring the healthcare industry, from a skill gap that is there in India?
Yeah, well, thank you, Neeraj, and it's wonderful to hear perspectives from material sciences, automotive, and chemicals. So switching gear here in terms of healthcare, if there's anything that COVID has taught us, right, is that resiliency in healthcare is just so critical for national security and for economic growth. And again, on the surface, Neeraj, as I reflect on your question, healthcare skills gap conversation may not have much to do with manufacturing, right? But it is the biggest leading indicator or a driver of demand for medical devices and healthcare. And we have to address, the following 5 factors. Number 1 is that there's no doubt that there's insatiable demand for healthcare. Number 2, there's a critical shortage of healthcare professionals in this country. Number 3 is that we have to skill and upskill labor. As we're thinking about manufacturing, the labor for medical devices, if we want to even transform from low value medical devices and equipment like gloves and to high tech, med tech instrumentation and devices like robotics. Number 4 is we have to create this robust ecosystem of a very skilled and trained supplier base, which is the echo I'm hearing on this in this conversation, is that the supplier-based resiliency, right? And then number 5 is that really increasing a very less spoken topic in India, but nevertheless very important, is increasing the diversity with female gender participation in manufacturing and lessons from other industries, including automotive and chemicals. So let me just break it down quickly. Number 1 is the demand for healthcare. We will have an insatiable demand for healthcare with the increasing burden of non-communicable diseases like cancer, cardiovascular conditions, but also as we continue to fight communicable diseases, which, by the way, COVID was an example of that. Now, this can be addressed through multiple investments. The government of India's budget is, at least step in the right direction to get us to a 2.5% to 3% investment in terms of our GDP. And it doesn't come as a surprise that the healthcare infrastructure spend, Neeraj, is 150,000 to 160,000 hospital beds are being added every year over the next 8 to 10 years. So that's number 1. Number 2 is just the shortage of skilled professionals. Again, is shocking. We are the country with one of the lowest doctor to patient ratios. 0.7 doctors and 1.5 nurses per 1,000 people compared to almost double the standards as mandated by WHO. And if we look at the graduates that are passing from our medical colleges as well, there's an opportunity to upskill them so that they have that standardized, quality that they can deliver, especially as the care is moving to smaller parts of India. And that's where many of the global manufacturers are also setting up bases, and they're bringing in talent, and the talent seeks healthcare. But we don't have advanced healthcare in these epicenters or manufacturing hubs. So that is an issue that we can solve for. Then the third piece is need to skill and upskill what I call the medical labor for transformation to medtech. And here we can accelerate adding skills programs for technicians and assistants right from high school. Neeraj, we catch them later, after school. Why can't we put programs in high school that are vocational tech training programs, particularly around health tech? So Health Sector Skills Council has embarked on it. And as industry, we have to invest in ongoing training, including adherence to quality, especially quality management systems and compliance standards. Those are the two missing links in India. And we have to, I'm sorry to say this, we have to change our chalta hai culture, when it comes to upskilling our labor. Number 4 is supplier base. And I know it's a common pain point here. Just to put things in perspective for this panel, for this panel here, medical devices is not developed in India. We have a fragmented ecosystem of 800 manufacturers. And to put things in perspective, 90% of these 800 manufacturers have a turnover of 7 million annually, Neeraj. 90% of medtech players in India have a turnover of 7 million annually. And now you think about their supplier bases that are further fragmented and even smaller. And now the expectations of them to comply with quality standards and compliance standards, world-class compliance standards. It's not feasible, it's not practical. So this is where medtech and pharma can learn from automotive. And Guenter, you're going to get a call from me in creating, a robust ecosystem of high quality tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 consolidated supplier base, integrating them into internal quality management systems, compliance training programs, and then of course, manufacturing process excellence, right? And the final point, which is close to my heart, is around women occupying leadership in manufacturing in India. We have women today, it is proven, right, that women that occupy even 30% of leadership positions on boards, those boards are 15% more profitable than companies with no women leadership, right? And here we are compared to 27 female participation in India, which is already low by global standards. Healthcare has only 11% participation. So this, I think, is a great opportunity for us to increase that participation of women in health sector, in R&D and manufacturing. Guenter, please feel free to add here.
Absolutely. Guenter, I was just about to come to you that, and then I would request Ramesh as well. While we wanted to discuss the R&D with you, Ramesh, but would be good to kind of get your views on the, one on the chemical sector and just overall as well. Guenter, first to you from a auto industry, from, I think Sandeep has raised some very interesting points, in terms of what are the few challenges and also what's been done well also. So your views on it?
I don't like to cover everything that has been mentioned by Sandeep, but since he has actually mentioned that he is going to call me the coming days, and shortly after he talked about the supply base, I thought I'd possibly pick up this particular topic because that's something very close to my heart. And you might know that I have been driving the strategic supplier-based development at Tata Motors very strongly, heavily the last 4 years. And was, I would say, a good success, but for exactly the same reasons you have mentioned, because the supplier base was extremely fragmented. We had lots of very small suppliers. I'll just give you a reference. I inherited more than 1,300 suppliers when I joined 5 years ago. Today we are at the level, and they were all more or less in a flat structure. So literally they all called themselves a so-called tier 1 supplier, because we were the ones who actually consolidated and built the structure and the components with high added value at our plants within Tata Motors. Not sustainable, not competitive, not comparable with the development in the rest of the world, but not as a recent development in the industry. This development has taken place, and Neeraj, you know it, because the industry and its development for decades. In the meanwhile, this is something that has happened globally 2 decades ago. So we were significantly running behind as far as the global development is concerned. And how would you like to be globally competitive on technology, but also as far as the commercial robustness of your supply chain is concerned, if you actually work with such kind of partners, which neither meet the basic requirements on the technical nor on the commercial side. Today, we have 400 suppliers whom we consider first-tier suppliers. If I go 1 level deeper, because this is Tata Motors commercial vehicle and passenger vehicles, but in particular in passenger vehicles, we still have some products which are now in production for more than a decade. Less so on the basis of the recent renewal of the PV product portfolio on the PV side. But if I take the recently launched Ultras, the first vehicle on the new architecture on which we are going to build the majority of our future products, including powertrain, have actually 120 suppliers. And these 120 suppliers have all been very carefully selected. They all meet global standards as far as their technical capabilities, so engineering footprint on ground, on material product design, but also on process capability. And at the same point of time, they are commercially sound. So they have the working capital that's required. They have the opportunity to take engineering tasks in an early stage of the product development, which is a prerequisite to actually build long-term sustainable partnerships and to actually leverage the opportunity of products which are much more modular in design in order to build economies of scale. It also required lots of changes internally, early engagement of the suppliers, supplier contracts, even without having the commercial terms fixed, putting a should costing cell in place in order to do a calculation of what a particular part against design process requirements is supposed to cost at the end of the product development as they actually go into production. A clear evaluation on the quality requirements on the one side, logistic requirements on the other side. That's a different world. It's a global world, but I think for India, we have made a significant change. And just listening to all of us, I think we would be somewhat interchangeable on our jobs, because yes, the topic would change, which we all provide to our customers, but the themes on which we would run the companies would be literally the same. So if we don't make reference to the businesses we are in, if it is health, chemical, or SVM, I think nobody would actually see for which industry we actually stand up and what kind of position we represent. So this is how close we are. And that's the reason why I said earlier, people always say it would be great if the automotive industry gets united. But on the topics we have just discussed, I think we need to get united as an industry body that goes beyond automotive, that goes beyond chemicals, because there is a lot out for us, in it for us, but out for us in order to be resolved in a very concerted and well-aligned effort. And that would actually bring everything into full play, because as you mentioned earlier, yes, automotive represents 49% of the manufacturing-related GDP, 8% of the total GDP. What is 80% of the total GDP? If we would actually throw all of our GDP contribution in one basket, our position would be even stronger. And I think this is what we need. We need to get united with the government in order to make the right calls and to really address the key pain points. It's funny to sit here and to listening to the health sector, and all of a sudden I hear something about the pain point is logistics and the supplier base. Thanks a lot. Your statistic has not necessarily given me great level of comfort living in India, but I do hope if it comes to the point, I can come back to you and can give you a call for advice.
So with that note, Ramesh, since it's an important topic, there. So maybe your quick comments on the skill aspect of it, and then we'll move to research and development, another area. Sure.
And I think both of them spoke extensively and quite expansively about this topic. But I think the whole concept of critical mass is the one I wanted to just point out. even if you look at the macro level, as an economy as a whole, I think there is a statistic out there which says that there are barely 20,000 companies or so which has a paid up capital of more than 10 crores. So if you raise the bar to, let's say, 100 crores paid up capital or 500 crores, etc., that number of companies who meet that threshold is going to drop off precipitously, right? It's going to drop off dramatically. So which goes to the point that the base is relatively narrow. And I think the capacity for all of these companies to invest and develop skills that are required, not only for themselves, but also for their supplier base, I think it's a dramatic and huge challenge. Now, yes, there are several partnerships that are going on right now between industry bodies. So I represent CII as well as my other hat. So, there is the Institute of Quality and several initiatives that industry bodies take to promote skills development amongst a few companies that can afford to take in absolutely raw graduates or raw students into the workforce, train them, mold them, and make them productive employees. So I think it's a much larger question because of the fragmentation of our industry itself and the fact that we don't have the critical mass to do everything. So partnerships become very important. I love looking at the SDGs. And then if you look at the SDG number 17, what does it say? It's all about partnerships, right? I think this topic brings home that point in spades.
So moving on to research and development, which also plays a fundamental role in fostering innovation. And also when you look at China, their rise in innovation prowess can also be attributed to the increase that they've had in the expenditure as well. They were, at some point in time, they were less than 1% is what they were investing, maybe about 20 years back. And today the expenditure is more than 2%, what they do. So in your view, Ramesh, are there any lessons to learn or areas to replicate, from China's manufacturing success? Given that innovation and R&D also would be one of the important parameters for Make in India. And when you answer that, maybe you want to just contrast it from a MSME sector perspective as well, which is also constrained by capital and scale issue that you were bringing about from a skill perspective.
Sure, that's a great question. So let me first give a couple of perspectives, probably from a couple of different angles. One is I'll talk a little bit about scale, which I think I just spoke about also in the previous comment. And the other is, of course, the criticality of investments in R&D and innovation at large. First is talking about scale. Let's look at what we are trying to achieve as a country. There is already a stated aspiration out there of a $5 trillion economy, in a few years to come. And there is also the target that we have to increase the manufacturing intensity in the economy. I think it's 15% or thereabouts now. We want to take it to 20, 25%. So, without getting into the specifics of the math, even a back of the envelope arithmetic says that, we need to, this path means we need about $500 to $800 billion more of value add coming from manufacturing over the next several years, whatever the time frame you want to pick. And that's a pretty massive increase in value add. We're talking about 500 to 800 billion. And then I just made the comment earlier, I won't repeat it, about the fact that we barely have a few companies which have the scale, 20,000 companies with 10 crores paid up capital. If you go to 100 or 500 crore paid up capital, it's far less. So the question is, if you want to deliver these 500 to 800 billion dollars of incremental value add, we need to build more scale and size in the economy, in the industry at large. That's number one. And that scale will also afford companies to invest in R&D, amongst other things. And this is an opportunity, obviously, not only for domestic companies, but also for foreign enterprises in India. Now, the PLI schemes is a great way to provide the impetus to invest in manufacturing, but to build a sustainable competitive advantage over the long term, it's very important to build moats, moats around differentiators, whether it's quality, whether it's new technologies, whether it's, you can look at productivity, etc. You could look at moats from different angles, but it's very critical to invest in new technologies to build those moats. And a well thought out R&D strategy and R&D investment strategy should complement a manufacturing strategy. Otherwise, you could end up becoming, at the low end of the value chain, and not capturing enough of the value addition in the entire end-to-end process. Now, you referenced China in your question. So I think it was back in 2014 or 15, this Made in China 2025 was launched in China. The key components of those are well known. I mean, key high technology sectors were identified, and they were identified to be the future drivers of growth for China. And there was also a strong focus on investing in R&D to make that happen. And in these emerging sectors that they had identified, and then transform the country to really become a technology leader. I mean, that was broadly how they approached the whole Made in China 2025 key sectors, whether it's new energy vehicles, aerospace, whether it's semiconductors and so on. In India, although our overall investment in R&D might be 0.6, 0.7% to GDP, I do believe that we can take a differentiated approach to our prioritized sectors. We don't have to get trapped in this headline number of 0.6, 0.7, because, as we know, we all run in our companies, we prioritize and we allocate resources to the best opportunities that we have. And I think we should be looking at it the same way. Otherwise, we could be sitting here waiting for a long time to be able to get that to, whatever percentages that we want. We benchmark with South Korea, we benchmark with other countries. So I think and basically, at a minimum, we need to look at investments in three fundamental levels in R&D, even taking from examples from our own company. One, of course, is in basic sciences, which is, you can look at it as the equivalent of innovation risk capital. So somewhere you've got to find a way to, what is the best way to fund, allocate, and to find the source of that capital. Government might have a role to play, institutions might have a role to play, etc. The second is utilizing our basic sciences and engineering for technology platform development. How do you develop platforms of different technologies using these basic sciences? And third is R&D investments, again, for leveraging these technology platforms for product development and problem solving, along with, of course, innovations in business model. So I think this kind of, when you can take this approach to prioritized sectors, and these need not be restricted by what is called out in the PLIs right now, the 12, 13 sectors that are called out. It could be technologies of the future, it could be markets of the future. So we could take a very thoughtful approach to this and see how do we get resources, R&D investments, and create that ecosystem we talk about into these sectors. This will further I think this will further strengthen our Make in India goals as well, by concurrently developing our whole capabilities in India. And of course, in doing all this, you can never do it all alone. You do leverage global knowledge. Right. So that would be my take on it. Yeah.
Sure. So Guenter, you raise your hand as well. So of course, come to you. May I just ask you for one more angle to it, to say that what Ramesh talked about, the fact like the innovation risk capital, you need a lot of patient capital as well, for any development of a new technology of the future. And overseas, we find this phenomena coming in more. There's established model that the government would kind of work with the industry, and then the industry would work with academia to kind of build the technology of the future. In India, largely the grants and funds are towards the industry, academia, and then the academia picks up, to work with the industry there. So is there a particular way that you see that we could follow through an established model which has been used overseas for technology development of the future?
Was a question to me, Neeraj?
Ramesh, if you could give a quick comment on it, and then we can move to Guenter.
Sure. Yeah, I think at the even if you look at the government, look at our principal scientific advisor, that they're all talking about this, and there are mechanisms that are being developed, being put in place to operationalize just what you spoke. But yes, the model here has been more through academia, academic institutions, and then having the partnerships with the industry to commercialize or even take it to the next, to develop the basic technologies into useful products and applications. Okay, how quickly or how well we can pivot from that model into a different model, I'm not so sure. but definitely I don't see why both the models cannot exist parallelly. Yeah.
Okay, Guenter, to you.
If you don't mind, I just would like to add one point, because there was a teaser. What I heard, you didn't say it explicitly, make in India. You didn't say, but you talked about design in India. And just as a thought for our conversation, look around and make up your mind how many, in particular in automotive, for example, how many of the vehicles actually run on the Indian roads could actually claim an indigenous design, or even on the component, on the module level, an indigenously designed component. But at the same point of time, if you look around, you find that lots of the multinationals who are active on ground in India, do have the offshore development centers. So why is it that we actually export the brain through the offshore development centers, but do not build the capability on ground in India, and do not actually force the multinationals to actually build indigenous solutions for the benefit of the Indian industry? So it's also, if you look into the IPs, it's a fair representation. Do we actually get the maximum from the intellectual capability, intellectual power that's available in India? Or do we just make the intellectual capability something for export? So are we more an intellectual capability export hub than a manufacturing hub, where we translate indigenized solution for global opportunities? Just as a question, I think this is something where India has a long way to travel and needs to play its intellectual capabilities much more effectively in favor of the country. It's for me like a company that has lots of raw material, but just exports the raw material instead of doing something out of the raw material and putting added value to it. This is for me the same when we take the Indian talent as far as engineering, in particular software engineering, is concerned.
So Mohan, that kind of leads in very nicely, to the question which I had as well. And of course we'll take your comment on this. So the question that I had for you was more in terms of the global supply chains. When you look at the country's participation, and then Guenter brought up the point that that we are, on the value addition point of view, our value additions have been lower, side of it there. So and if you put it differently, then our participation is more with the backward linkage than with the forward linkages around it. So how do you see this landscape evolving over the next 2 through 3 years, from your industry perspective, or a broad span of 3 to 5 years, there?
So maybe I go back a little bit, because
Sure.
with this research topic, the innovation topic, in a layman's language, what I always say in my company is that it's very difficult to come up with research and innovation when you don't know how to manufacture. So the problem where lies in the fact that when we decided as an economy to jump from ag to services, we somehow missed the important step of manufacturing. So an entire generation of us grew up consuming things not knowing how it is made. Nobody thought about it. What does it take to make this stuff? If you were consuming, it's because somewhere you earned the money out of some services, and then you bought it from some market in the world who made it. And you brought the question about research in China and why is China able to strategize into these priority sectors and able to get the people to do it. Because for the last 45 years, they have set up this engineering and manufacturing from the ground. And they have got an entire generation of people who know how to a nut and a bolt works. And I'm sure a large population in this country doesn't know how these things work. So that's the take. But now it's not all dull and gloom. Now I'm not here to sell the dull and gloom. The fact is that as an economy, yes, we have woken up. The government has woken up and said we aspire to get to the 5 trillion and a trillion in manufacturing and so on. So there's an aspiration. Are we going to do it in 2 to 3 years? Exactly your question. No, we are not going to do this in 2 to 3. We are not going to reach where China achieved in 40 years in 2 to 3 years. This is a generation kind of a thing. We need to work through it. Now, do we need to take the same number of years? No, we don't need to take the same number of years, because technology is changing. I mean, in my own sector, the kind of energy, the whole energy equations are transforming. The digital ways of manufacturing or robotics. So we don't necessarily have to go through all the steps at the same slow speed. We will have to learn the basics, sure, but we can do it faster. Yeah. So I don't see it in 2 to 3 years, but if you take more or less a strategic horizon 10, 15 years, probably then we could come up to a point where we are in that league. Yeah. Now, what do we need to do? Yes, we need to do invest into manufacturing to a large extent. Now, again, so in between there was this topic about MSMEs, and in the old days we had the SSI culture. I'm not against that, and I think it's pretty much part of an ecosystem. When you build an ecosystem, you need companies of all sizes. Yeah, but you cannot be in a position where you only support subscale through artificial trade barriers, and thereby have no incentive to be globally competitive. So if you want to win a battle or even be equals in a global manufacturing setup, you need corporations which are able to compete globally without those trade barriers. And that comes with investments in competitiveness, it comes with investments in technology, it comes with investments in people. So that's something which I really vouch for, and it's something which we as a country need to do. And I'm very confident that if we do these things, not in 2 to 3 years, but 10 to 15 years, you will see a perspective where we can be part of global supply chains, we can be part of global value chains to a larger extent.
So Sandeep, coming to you, Mohan raised certain points around the fact that why we are not part of the global value chain. And then I had raised the point as well to say that we are, from a forward linkage perspective or complex manufacturing aspect of it, we are not so much there. And medical devices would fall into that category of an advanced manufacturing, complex manufacturing aspect of it. So when you look at the conversation that you had, and also contrast this or let's say zoom into more from a medical devices perspective, if India is aspiring to be a global hub for medical devices, what are the few things which the government should be looking at, and as industry, how we get for that?
I think, again, as I had mentioned, Neeraj, our industry, medtech, right now is a very small industry, in India. So you're looking at somewhere around $7 to $8 billion. That's about it. With the potential to double, triple, based on a few fundamental drivers that have to go into place, right? And even when you look at the manufacturing that happens, is mostly low value add. And 86% of your medical devices today are imported. There are companies like MNCs, for all the reasons that have been discussed before, that have made investments into India, but have not scaled up to become export powerhouses. So what are some of the ways to kind of get there? So number one is, like we touched before, is really the infrastructure. Creating, for us, it's very important to have dedicated zones where we can bring in innovation and capabilities. So dedicated medtech zones. I know there are pharma bulk drug parks are being set up, and they literally are these infrastructure facilities that have common utilities, common facilities. You have common power plant units, steam generators, waste, effluent management, water treatment systems, sterilization units. I had to put a sterilization unit into our plant here in India because we couldn't find one outside, right? So imagine the smaller companies that cannot afford to do that. And a sterile medical device is a necessity, right? If it's going to be put into a patient. So those kind of fundamentals, cold chain, when you're thinking vaccines, cold chain transport, common supplier basis. So I think creating that ecosystem in healthcare parks, pharma bulk drug parks, that's number one. Number two, I think we have to get to simplifying our tax structure and building on the momentum of the GST reform. I think GST reform has been good, where it's given some sort of structure. It's reduced the logistics in many ways, but I think there's more to be done here in terms of simplifying to two rates, whether it's 12%, 18%, or other rates, and no exception other than zero rated items. There's also an opportunity to bring in energy, petrol, power into the GST. So I'd say simplifying the tax structure will be another one. The third piece of this is the overall connectivity. For us to logistics costs, we've been discussing logistics. Logistics costs are such a big burden on our P&Ls, and for us to have a simplified, a well-connected network, whether you have, and I think a lot of progress is being made. You're looking at dedicated freight rail corridors that are being put together, connecting the east to west and north to south. You're looking at daily national highway constructions that are happening, 75 kilometers or so per day last year. More airports into tier 2, tier 3. For us, Neeraj, patients are seeking care closer to home. COVID has made patients' care seek closer to home. There are more cardiovascular surgeries happening in cities like Lucknow than they're happening in urban centers like Gurgaon, right? And what happens there is you need that connectivity to airports. You need that connectivity, or even the flow of goods wherever you're manufacturing. Yeah, the multimodal networks that were brought up on logistics, whether it's roll, rail, air, sea, that has to come to fruition as well. Creating ecosystems of domestic MNCs and MSMEs. I know it's a sore topic here, but an ecosystem approach, because end of the day, you cannot set up all capabilities as MNCs. So creating that ecosystem, creating a robust supplier base is another point, Neeraj, that we have to do. And from an R&D perspective, getting incentives, I think the Department of Pharmaceuticals has done a phenomenal job here to set a tone around investing in medical devices. It's given production-linked incentives, but I think more needs to be done to really accelerate things for MedTech India.
So with this, I know we are kind of running out of time, but with you gentlemen there, just want to end with a note from your perspective to say that when we know Japan is kind of known for quality, German for precision, and Chinese for scale. That's what comes to our minds usually. So when you look at Indian manufacturing in the years to come, what do you think will define Indian manufacturing? And do you see your industry going that way? A quick 30 to 45 second view, starting Ramesh with you, then going to Mohan, Guenter, and Sandeep.
Sure, I'll take a stab at it. I don't know if I can come up with a pithy line, but I think Guenter said it. We are an engineering talent. We are strong engineering capabilities and talent in the country. Strong software capabilities, and now with the merge, with the confluence of manufacturing, industry 4.0, Internet of Things and services. So I think engineering, software, all of this comes together. I think we should be the engineering capital of the world, and really accelerate manufacturing, leveraging those capabilities to building companies at scale in India, which are globally competitive. So I need to work on it, to wordsmith it, so that I can come up with a simple pithy line.
Sure, Mohan, on to you.
So from the manufacturing industry and the chemical industry perspective, I see that we are more or less where the West was probably in the 60s in terms, if you draw an S curve of economic development and the manufacturing. That's where I see ourselves, or the Japanese were probably in the 70s and 80s. Now, my philosophy there is rather simple. We don't have to first create the gray skies and then try to transform into the blue skies. In the context of power, in the context of energy, in the context of chemicals, going the way in a sustainable manner, making sure that we don't go through the entire learning curve, but bypass some of those and get into low carbon footprint products and low carbon footprint technologies, and having the sustainability at the core of it, and developing an industry and the ecosystem which connects largely, and has very little waste and transforms waste into products which can be used by the next in the value chain. So that's something, again, I don't have the perfect words for it on short notice, but sustainability at the middle of everything that we do is what I see for the chemical industry and manufacturing industry.
Great. Guenter, to you. Quick closing comment.
Mohan has actually delivered me the keyword for my statement, sustainability. As I also do believe that sustainability is going to be the challenge in the years to come. I do believe that the future of automotive is electric. And if India is going to be known focusing on the electrification for having demonstrated the ability to rise to the occasion, to actually rise to the need of electronics, leveraging the software capabilities, as already mentioned by Ramesh. And we have all of these capabilities in much larger numbers than anybody else in the world. And at the same point of time, we could join hands and could invest in a dedicated manner, following the government's phased manufacturing plan as part of phase 2, investing in electric vehicle components, e.g. batteries, for example, and many others in the same context, then I think India is going to be known in a couple of years as the global hub for electric vehicles in the passenger vehicle space as well as for commercial vehicles. It looks like a dream today, but I think we can rise to the occasion and can really demonstrate that this country has a unique capability, and that's leapfrogging. And I believe in the leapfrogging capability as far as e-mobility is concerned.
Thanks. Sandeep, over to you. You've got the benefit of the 3 people speaking, so I'm looking forward to that punchline as well.
No, it comes down. Look, we're the most populated, second most populated country in the world, and we keep talking about how many people we have. But I think the bigger thing is what Ramesh was saying here. We are our value proposition can be access to world-class human capital. You think in healthcare, second largest pool of pharma and biotech talent after China, the number of PhDs we have, and yet we are grossly underrepresented in research and development. And that's the fundamental disconnect. And that to me is a much larger opportunity, regardless of the sector. So for us, if India can tap into really maximizing this world-class human capital and getting it focused on solving the issues for what drives India's innovation as well as global priorities. So if it's making India a pharma capital of the world, specialty pharma, not just generic pharma. If it means making India from a 1.8% market share player in medtech to a significant 20% player on value add medtech. Electric vehicles, like Guenter said, if it's automobiles, not low cost, old technology cars selling in value add markets, but next generation electric vehicles. So putting a stake, I think, on the really the value drivers for global economy that are going to shape the global economy, and putting our minds and brains across all sectors. The problems are the same across all sectors towards it. So I would put my bet on a world-class human capital.
And I would kind of agree to say that if you see the amount of engineering and R&D centers, which have been now established in India over the last few years from a India perspective, from global companies, there's been a tremendous increase, which has happened on that, and there's a huge potential for India to. While we discussed R&D in a good amount of detail, but that's an area where more work can happen. So with this, I thank you all, for sharing your valuable insights. I know, no time is enough to get the knowledge, from all 4 of you with, very different industries. I think we had a very different perspectives coming in, all pointing out towards the fact that, India definitely needs to kind of emerge as a manufacturing hub. There is a good potential for that. And to be able to get there, we need a combination of perhaps, the investor-friendly environment, right policy interventions, enabling productivity-led educational ecosystem, and also faster development of infrastructure, which kind of got emphasized on the panel multiple times. And I would say that what Guenter said in the middle, relentless focus on implementation of these policies that the government has done up there. And if I just add, I think what Sandeep has said on the taxation part of it also, I think the predictability of the taxation environment, predictability of the policies is another area, where it would help the overseas companies to kind of look at India as one of the larger manufacturing destinations, and for all of us to be proud that we would emerge as a global manufacturing hub for some select sectors for sure. With that, thank you very much, everyone, for your time. I really appreciate you coming and sharing your insights with all of us today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, the winning strategy for companies has clearly been digital transformation. Technologies such as artificial intelligence, IoT, robotics, and cognitive computing are pushing the boundaries of the possible, and several use cases for the manufacturing sector have already been embraced. The potential is apparent, and now the challenge seems to fully realize it. And that's what our next panel is all about.
Welcome everyone to this session on advanced technologies and trends making production efficient for manufacturing in India. I'm very happy and excited to be here. I extend my warm welcome to our distinguished panelists, Kamal Bali, MD Volvo Group in India, Sanjeev Sharma, MD and CEO ABB India and South Asia, Alok Nanda, CTO GE South Asia and GE GITC India, and Suvojoy Sengupta, partner at McKinsey and Company. Thanks very much everyone for taking out your time and for being with us today, for sharing your views on the technology theme with the industry. Let me begin with to set a quick frame for our discussions today. There is a growing emphasis on supply chain realignment by companies globally, and there is also a critical need for India to reduce its import dependencies. Are the two of the key triggers that we believe are there behind the government's renewed focus on manufacturing. And in that light, it is imperative to also mention that it has been beset by problems of low productivity and availability of cheaper imports substitutes. The sector of share in India's GDP has remained range-bound since the last 2 decades. However, despite the apparent stagnancy, renowned companies from around the world have remained bullish on tremendous potential of India's manufacturing ecosystem. Going forward, while India has the opportunity to further cement its position as an attractive destination for companies looking to rebalance their manufacturing capabilities, we believe that the country needs to wholeheartedly embrace the Industry 4.0 or the intelligent networking of machines and processes for manufacturing industry to seize this opportunity. With this brief context, allow me to start the discussion with our esteemed panelists to have a fuller picture on how, by embracing usage of AI, IoT, and modern control systems, this problem of low productivity can be dealt with, and also the role the government can play in incentivizing companies and leveraging greater tech in India's advanced manufacturing excellence journey. Kamal, let me come to you first. While on one hand, the ensuing global trade dynamics continue to expose the supply chain vulnerabilities, countries like India are focusing efforts towards reducing import dependency, and India specifically has launched the Atmanirbhar Bharat program. How is the auto industry coping up with fostering localization at a time when the government reforms are also encouraging Indian companies to expand their manufacturing footprint, both in the country and also globally?
Yeah, thank you, Neeraj. And that's a good question. And thank you for having me on this panel. Neeraj, as you know, exports has been an integral part of automotive sector in India, but probably limited in certain segments, small and medium-sized cars and certain products of typical in the typical band. But if you look at some of the players in India now, we are already supporting close to 1,000 crores of component exports through our suppliers out of India, because I think without getting scale, because exports provides you scale, and that is actually contingent upon all manufacturing companies to really to embrace exports in a big way. And we have also very glad to say on as part of Volvo, we have made India the global duty engine hub for the entire world. So we produce all close to 50,000, 60,000 engines, Euro 6 engines in India, and we supply to the entire world from India. So I think that's the second piece. I think the key point which you have actually mentioned here is there are still many segments of the industry where the demand is very low and therefore localization becomes a challenge. So here our suggestion has been that, and I think government is also listening in a very good way, that we need to have a concept of progressive phased manufacturing program. I think one of the very old concepts, but I think it works very, very well, that there's a clear-cut time frame which the government or the administration agrees with companies that, okay, you're allowed to import 60-70% import content right now in your products, but over a time span of 3 to 5 years, you will localize and bring the local content to 60, 70, 80%. I think that would be the right approach. And I think that is one approach which is paving way, as I see very, very clearly. The second is that the government initiatives on ease of doing business, cost of doing business are already in the right direction, but many more reforms are required on custom duty rationalization, on GST rates rationalization, which government in this budget has promised that they will sit together with industry bodies, and over the next 3 to 4 months, they will look at all these duty lists, custom duty lists and all, and bring it and review and rationalize by 1st October 2021. But I think more importantly, I mean, the biggest takeaway for me out of, especially in the last 1 year, is the rebalancing of global value chains, which is happening across the world. And we believe that more than $4 trillion of global value chain will be rebalanced over the next 3 to 4 years. And I think this could be India's manufacturing moment, because today, if you look at 2018 data, just one country, China, accounts for 30% of entire global manufacturing output, and India contributes just about 3%. And post-pandemic, there is very, very clear indications that about roughly $4 to $4.5 trillion of this $15 trillion global manufacturing economy will be rebalanced. And this could obviously go to Mexico, Vietnam, India. Of course, there are many, many players who are vying for this pie. To my mind, this is India's manufacturing moment. And this budget, which has been a remarkable budget, I think sets the right framework to attract more investments into India, and really whether it is in infrastructure, automotive industry, and therefore things like PLI. On one end, we said cost of doing business, ease of doing business. This PLI is a real big, I would say, incentive for companies to look at India, because we still have certain hidden costs in our power tariffs, in our many components not included in GST, some of the by value about 30-40%, which is not included in GST, which actually leads to indirect cascading of the costs. So I think if some of those things can be done, and government agrees on a phased manufacturing program and sets a very clear direction, I think that is the moment for India, and automotive industry will actually, to my mind, lead this phase, being almost 45% of total manufacturing in India. I think automotive industry could actually set the pace and pace for manufacturing, making India a manufacturing powerhouse. I will stop there. I have a couple of other points, but I will keep them for later. Yeah.
No, thanks very much, Kamal, for that. Suvojoy, if I may come to you for this, Kamal brought out some interesting points that that there is 3 or 4 areas to look at in terms of a phased manufacturing program. He did spoke about EODB and also PLI, supportive as to this exercise, and also there are some hidden aspects also from a cost point of view, which you mentioned around that almost 30 to 45% items are not included as part of GST currently and are adding to the cost. And if I just add to that, there has always been a talk about low productivity, the fact that we have availability of cheaper import substitutes. There are inefficiencies as well in our infra system. Our logistics cost has always been compared with the likes of what Kamal brought out in terms of Vietnam and Thailand, countries which are smaller than us, but they have been able to establish themselves as export hubs around it. So given these challenges, how do you see the industry trending over the next 12 to 18 months? If you were to paint a bit of a picture for us in terms of the crucial areas the government should focus on as well to realize this goal of, and if I borrow from Kamal, the phased manufacturing program the country should undertake.
Thank you very much, Neeraj, and thanks for inviting me to the panel. I think about a few months ago, my colleague Rajat Dhawan and I had published an article on this, and where we looked at and very much agree with Kamal that this is the moment for manufacturing in India, and over the next 10 years, 8 to 10 years, there's a huge opportunity, not just to increase the size of the manufacturing activity, but also increase what we call the gross value add or the GVA of it. And we had looked at a little bit of benchmarking across different sectors and different value chains with different countries. And there are a lot of disparities even between India and some of the Southeast Asian countries. So just as an example, in food processing, India's average GVA is about 11 to 13%, whereas a country like Indonesia is in the 30s. Or in textiles, India is about 18% and Bangladesh is 25 to 27%. So we don't need to look into mature economies, but even in emerging economies in Southeast Asia, there are gaps in many of these sectors where the gross value added in India can be increased. So not just do more, but do differently. That was our overall conclusion out of that. And there are a couple of important drivers for that. One is, of course, the reason why this is a bit of a vicious cycle. That productivity is low because of a number of reasons. The level of adoption of Industry 4.0, IoT, analytics, machine learning, etc., is still quite low. And part of the reason we see is that in many of the manufacturing sectors, the small and medium enterprises form the backbone of these sectors. And for some of them, I think awareness of these technologies is not quite there. Even if they are there, probably they don't have the scale or the ability to invest into these technologies. As a result, then the return on capital goes down. And we looked at that also in some of the sectors where the return on capital is way below the weighted average cost of capital in these sectors in India. So our conclusion was that while the ease of doing business type of initiatives and interventions are important, but they take a long time to kind of fructify. So what's required is more of an end-to-end view or across a few of these value chains. And I think some of the value chains are well represented even in this group, like capital goods and automotive, where there's a huge opportunity, both in terms of tapping into the domestic manufacture as well as for exports. And we see that increasing the productivity is an important lever to do that. And that, of course, with companies like GE and ABB with their global footprint and technologies, they're able to do this very well. But the same kind of awareness and ability to adapt these solutions in the SME sector is where urgent attention is probably required. And there, I think, a couple of ideas where what the government can do. I think we have a good, strong technology industry backbone. So the solutions are here, and these solutions are being developed for global companies out of India. So it's not like we don't have access to these solutions. But where the government can do something, for example, is a type of digital competency centers. So we have helped set up something like that. McKinsey has worked with government of Singapore to set up a digital capability center where some of these solutions are demonstrated and showcased, where companies can see them, connect with other companies, solution providers in the background. So government can do something like that, play a catalytic role. We also think there's a need for a national manufacturing technology mission, which can bring some of these technologies in an accelerated way to the Indian companies.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Suvojoy, for that. And then you did name the ABB and GE, and we have both representation at us from this panel point of view. So Alok, if I may come to you, Suvojoy did mention around the challenge that there is while we are doing R&D in India, but there is for some of the global companies, but there is proliferation of that, and also in terms of usage of that, maybe because of awareness or limited capabilities. He did mention around that. Would you give us your perspective in terms of that what are the few things which the government can do in terms of the areas around the R&D benefits, concessions, and incentives, so that the company which are driving some of the global innovation agenda that gets furthered on from an India perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Neeraj, and thanks for inviting me for this panel. So R&D, I mean, research is very close to my heart, and I see it being done globally. And when I look at India and how research is done in India and compare it with how research is done all around the world, there is one very crucial difference, and which makes our companies in India non-competitive when it comes to research as compared to companies all around the world. And I'll tell you why I say that and why I believe that. So any company has invests in R&D, and Indian companies do it a lot better now than what we used to do a decade ago. It's for innovation for today, innovation for tomorrow, and innovation for future. And most companies invest their own money into R&D when it comes to innovation for today and tomorrow. And all around the world, innovation for future happens in collaboration with government, academia, and industry. So if you see how GE does its far field innovation in US or in Europe, is in partnership with agencies like ARPA-E, with academia, all come together, all create technology, move forward. Now in India also, government spends a lot of money, but there is one crucial difference. When in India, government gives money for a far field kind of research, they give it to the academia. And what has happened good in the last 5-6 years is academia started working with industry, but the money to execute those problems, those solutions goes to academia, and it's not their core strength to program manage it to a solution. Now, you take that in US when we work in GE in US when we work on a far field solution, when government or gives the money through an agency like ARPA-E or DARPA, the money comes to the industry, and industry has partners in academia and everyone. Industry program manages it to the solution. And so you see the development of technology, the solutions come much more in an aggressive manner. And what happens in India is because industry doesn't participate in that far-reaching solutions, we are always in a catch-up game whenever a new innovative, disruptive technology comes. And then it's too late to invest, because then you rather grow inorganically rather than growing organically. So I think if we really want to change the paradigm of innovative work in India or research work in India, we need to adopt some of the methods which are so successful around the world. I'm not asking for government to spend more money. They spend quite a bit of money. It's pretty good, actually, if you see how DST does or some of the other government agencies does. They need to trust the industry a lot more and make them partners and actually leaders in doing research and development. And that will change the game in India, and we will no longer be always in a catch-up game in a disruptive technology world. And we will be the leaders because there is no problem with either talent or infrastructure. Our talent only goes to US and Europe and does all that innovation, but it is not able to do it because innovation requires a little bit of that capital support, and it can't happen with industries putting their revenue and their profits into a far field research. It's not done anywhere in the world, and to expect it to happen in India, I think we are making our companies non-competitive for long-term research by not addressing this big gap that we have.
So Sanjeev, if I may come to you, Alok raised certain points with respect to the fact that that the funding is not an issue, but in terms of the fact that there is a kind of a already established method and process which is followed overseas, and he did allude to that in terms of the government to industry and then to academy around it. And if I just see some of the numbers around it, so we see that almost 0.6% of GDP is what India is today spending on the R&D aspect of it. When you contrast this with China with 2% plus, when you contrast with South Korea, it's almost 5%. Likewise for Israel as well. There when to like 4 to 5% of GDP is what they're spending. Of course, India size of the GDP is also different, but from your perspective, how do you see that more contribution coming in, and then in the government has in this budget also given about 50,000 crore rupees to set for the National Research Foundation as well, there. So if you were to look at it from an industry perspective, what would be your views on this area?
Thank you, Eat India. Thank you, Neeraj, for inviting me on this panel. I think very good points made by all the panelists as well as Alok. From the R&D perspective, I think let's look at it what we have before we look at it what we don't have. Well, what we really have today is a country which has fairly good number of problem statements to be solved, right? So we have a fairly large number of problem statements to be solved for serving the citizens of this country. So that's something which is very rich, assortment available. Secondly, if you really look into large companies like ABB, GE, and many others, they have very large R&D centers based out of India. And we do research on the global problem statements on behalf of the global product managers, right? So it means you can say we have the talent in-house, which really knows how to carry out the research on different activities. Now is the question of whether we require very significant participation from the government to catalyze it. I think as and when happens, I think we should welcome it. But till then, I think the kind of environment we have in this country, I think entrepreneurs, they can put their capital in it, because once you solve the large problem statements, I think there's a big, huge market to be tapped in. So I would say use what we have, and then as and when government is able to organize itself to support this in the way that Alok described, that to bring different elements together, I think we should continue to take benefit of it. So from our point of view, we do prepare some solutions which are very specific to the country. We take those problem statements, we put it into the R&D setup within the country, just like, for example, solar pumps, wherein a villager or a farmer has a difficulty buying the diesel, right? But if you create a solar water pump, which we created and developed in the country, we are able to solve a good problem wherein the lands can be irrigated by using pump, and you have a lower carbon footprint, but also you are able to deal with the problems. So that would be my point of view when it comes to R&D. We should take the problem statement, use the talent we have, and encourage even from the industry side that we start bringing India-specific solutions.
Great. So Sanjeev, if I ask you another question here, given that there is a trend that we're seeing that earlier there was a lot of these sectors in terms of like FMCG, warehouse were which are adopting a lot of automation part of it there, but currently we see a lot of labor-intensive sectors as well in terms of mining, cement, metals, etc. also embracing a lot of change from a digitalization perspective around it. So when you look at the industrial automation in general, do you see that that is getting much more broad-based now? And in terms of emerging areas, how do you see the demand going forward in the industry?
So we have different types of industrial automation. So one is the process industries, like say refineries, petrochemical plants, cement plants, pulp and paper plant, steel plants. So there, I believe the usage of industrial automation is quite good. Now, what they are doing at the next level is they are IoTizing their assets, and they are also adding digital layers on it so that they can get more productivity out of their assets. So that's one layer of process automation, industrial automation. The second part is the shop floor automation, wherein you do the manufacturing of the goods. And there we see a good trend now, emerging trend of using a lot of robotics to make sure that we have things that can be manufactured at a scale, and also with a lot of precision, as well as you can change the batches much more quickly. I think that's another one. And the third level is the machine automation, wherein the OEMs, they are making their machines almost like they're digital ready, so that whichever plant it goes into, it's a plug and play, and a lot of data can come out of different elements of that machine, so that the reliability, availability, maintainability, and serviceability of those equipment, when they are part of the large industry, it becomes much easier and more productivity can be extracted. And last but not the least, the digitalization is a common theme among all these three industrial types I mentioned, wherein providing the solution at the top layer on top of these installations, you will find that more productivity can be extracted. And quite frankly, in India, we have best-in-class examples of large-scale industrial automation implementation. Like, for example, the largest refinery in the world is in India, and it is really automated to its teeth. And they continue to automate both on the electrical side as well as process side. The largest paint manufacturer in the country has a very short conversion of raw materials to cash, even better than many global leaders in that particular area, purely because a lot of automation has gone into it. Automotive industry uses a lot of robotics. And now we see in the FMCG area, in the area of electronics manufacturing, a lot of penetration of robotics is coming. And also in the electric vehicles, like yesterday only we announced for Ola that we are partnering with them to set up a very world scale scooter manufacturing facility in the country where a lot of robotics will be used. And we also know, and I'm not at the liberty to talk about it, but we have a customer who has already starting a very large manufacturing, electronics manufacturing, which will be mostly export led, connecting with what Kamal was talking about earlier, that not only for the domestic demand, now some kind of a demand and the manufacturing is moving to the country. And I believe these are the catalytical projects. Once they get implemented in 6 months, 1 year, 1.5 years, I think that encourages other players also to start rolling into the country, because Vietnam didn't happen overnight. It took some time before people found their confidence. And I believe with these critical projects and critical scale projects that we do it well. I believe, we will get quite a bit of confidence back into the country's manufacturing intent, capability, and the local ecosystem to support it.
Absolutely, Kamal.
Yeah, Neeraj, I just wanted to just come back and come to support Alok's point on creation of IPs and R&D in India. I just want to very quickly share an example on what he spoke about, the partnership between government, academia, and industry, which we in Swedish lingo will call it a triple helix approach. So this is something which we have taken off in the last 1 year by forming something called CITES, which is Sweden India Transport Innovation and Safety Platform, where 14 different players from India and Sweden, from government agencies, from academia, and from industry have come together to solve some of the burning issues on transport safety and innovation. And this is working very well. And therefore, there are agencies, government agencies like Venova from Sweden and DST from India, who are going to support this entire platform. So this is a complete platform which is going to work across the various dimensions, whether it is the problem statement, the competency to solve those problems, and to commercialize and scale up all of this. So this is just to confirm what Alok said. And I think this could be the way forward to create those IPs in India and to give a fillip to R&D. That's a short point there.
No, sure. Thanks much for that, Kamal. And Sanjeev did mention around the electric vehicles part of it as well. So I was wanting to get your views as well on that. And you brought about the cost part of it as well. That currently there is a lot of concern in terms of the high cost of the EV components, which is making the industry less competitive as well there. And in terms of new technology implementation, so while Sanjeev, Suvojoy did mention around the fact that there is with industrial automation, there is productivity which is coming in, there would be some amount of benefits on the cost as well. What would be your view on driving cost optimization in your industry? And also in terms of government has done several things, but what are the 2-3 more things which the government can do to make this sector truly attractive?
Yeah, so Neeraj, just to start with the important point that unfortunately the discussions on electric vehicles in India seem to have really superseded the discussions on sustainable mobility. You know, we have been focusing not on public transport, not on making transport overall sustainable. We have been focusing, and the narrative has only been electric vehicles, which is all right, which is a very important element, but it is only one of the 3 or 4 elements of sustainable transport, because otherwise you are at the danger of moving the future cities which have been congested with diesel and petrol vehicles. You could make them congested with electric vehicles. So I think there are 3 or 4 key points. We need to look at mobility in a sustainable way. But I think electric vehicle, just coming to one of the elements in sustainable mobility, it's a very important element. I think scale and technology are 2 things which are going to really be the game changer in this. As Volvo, we have, just to let you know, couple of developments. Volvo and Daimler, we have signed up a partnership to focus on hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles. So Daimler, which is our competitor, and Volvo are working together for heavy commercial vehicles to bring in hydrogen fuel cell technology. And we have also just about a month back formed another business area called Volvo Energy, which will actually focus on battery technology and several other things. So I think this is electric vehicles are electric, whether it is battery electric or hydrogen cell electric, you know. So I think this is going to be the future. And the key lies, I think what government could do is basically aggregate market across state corporations, you know. I think this is what industry needs, is scale, so that we can invest, industry can invest more. So if all the 27 state governments, state transport corporations can club their requirements under a central banner, I think it will give everybody the visibility. Hey guys, this is the market. Now put your money there. I think that's something. Our market is highly fragmented. I think that is something we need to see. Other is look at the payback that is with respect to adoption of public transport in city versus reduction in congestion, increased safety, reduced emissions, reduced infrastructure development, the total life cycle cost or the social impact cost. Many times we are just looking at the initial cost of a particular solution, and that is why many technologies get pushed back, because the initial cost is much larger than the cost available for the alternatives right now, whereas the life cycle cost or the social impact cost could be better. So I think that's the second piece. And I think also when it comes to public transport like buses and trucks, I think these sectors must get infrastructure status. Unfortunately, buses and trucks fall under the luxury category of GST at 28%, whereas I think these are the minimalistic thing. They should not be taxed more than 12% GST. I mean, I think that these are some of the supports if government can provide to sustainable transport methodology. I think it will be a great thing. And just the second point on this, just to let you know, I mean, overall, not in terms of just electric vehicles, but if I come back to manufacturing, there are a number of shifts happening, which I think my friend Sanjeev has already spoken about. And in fact, that is his area of competence. But I think consumer experiences, mass customization, Internet of Things, 3D printing, additive manufacturing, reshoring of manufacturing, new regulations and compliances, and sustainable. I think sustainability in everything which you do, I think these are going to be the real future narratives, because I was speaking to you about exporting 1,000 crore worth of components from tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers in India to, so now they are going to face challenge because if they cannot certify how much carbon footprint, if they do not measure the carbon footprint which they are creating, or how carbon neutral they are over time, 3 to 4 years down the line, we will face a huge problem. So sustainability is going to become a very, very important element and narrative in future manufacturing. So whatever you do has to be environmentally friendly, socially inclusive, economically efficient, and morally ethical. So I think unless you tick those 4 boxes, manufacturing is going to face another challenge. So I would like to just add this bit to what I said earlier. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Kamal. A long list, for requirements perspective. And if I go to Suvojoy, on this, Suvojoy, in your article that you written also, you have talked about creation of a mechanism where we've got incentivization done for time-bound localization to happen around it. And you did alluded to it in the earlier conversation around it. I think if we and just now Kamal mentioned about socially inclusive, sustainable, low carbon footprint value chains around it. And these are all requiring a lot more investment to go in as well, and require perhaps initial funding to come in through as well. Give us some thoughts in terms of how viability gap funding could help in this particular area. And are there any financial reforms that are needed as well from the government to act as more enabler in this perspective?
I think that's a great point. And Sanjeev had mentioned earlier about these catalytic projects, right? So what is the role of government, or earlier what the public sector entities used to do, and now more government is where there is risk and where the business model is not proven. This kind of funding for catalytic projects is something that actually helps de-risk and reduce the risk. And once the risk is reduced to an acceptable level, private capital can come in, right? So there are many such areas. Hydrogen is a great example where right now, everyone is very excited about it, but people think it's a 5 to 7 years out. Is there a way that the government can come in and say that, look, let's take a stretch of highway, 300-400 kilometer stretch of highway, and we will actually invest in creating the hydrogen infrastructure around it, right? And, put 100-200 trucks running on hydrogen. And that creates a lot of confidence for investors to come in and, bring in the capital. If you see what happened on the solar side, and we all know the story, at one time it was 15 or 17 rupees. And the role of the solar mission and SECI, etc., at that time, they didn't take a move towards subsidizing solar. There was some of it in the beginning. But systematically, the risk was reduced. The quality of the PPAs increased. The solar park kind of approach was taken. So we have done this before. So I think this is one approach that the government then says in these slightly more, what I call Horizon 2 type of areas, where there's a risk of India losing the bus and other countries getting ahead. Government stepping in a meaningful way and investing to create these kind of lighthouse catalytic projects, which increases the confidence. So I think that is one. Second, I think if I'm glad Kamal mentioned about sustainability, where this is not this is not a cost to business. This is a huge opportunity to business. You see the kind of investment that the European Union green stimulus package, 750 billion euros that they have announced. It opens up a huge set of opportunities for companies based in emerging markets to tap into that, to build products and services for those, which will eventually come to India. Maybe in a few years' time, the business model will be there. So here, there's a role that the government can do to say that if Indian companies are trying to build manufacturing capabilities to serve that market, is there a fund that can be set up into this to help facilitate investments ahead of time? And finally, there is a role for what we call patient capital. So sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, who are not looking for a 3-year return on this investment, but are really looking to use their capital to achieve certain slightly longer term goals. That could be decarbonization, that could be social upliftment of people from poverty. It could be other kind of resource conservation type of objectives. And there are enough businesses, and there's a huge pool of capital out there in this in the world, looking for viable ways of being invested. So energy efficiency is a great example where we can see that there's lots of opportunity in India. Manufacturing of energy efficient appliances, industrial appliances, Smart metering, another big area where there's a big rollout in India, several crores of smart meters that are happening. And so there is actually patient capital with a mandate for looking for so-called ESG type of deployment that is waiting there. And therefore creating viable projects, and the government can again play a role in that to attract and match up that supply with the supply of capital with the opportunity. So these are some ideas that can be pursued, but the opportunity is immense, and with the right kind of collaboration can be unlocked.
So Alok, if I may come to you, so we just spoke about the government side of things in terms of what the government can do and government should focus on, a few of the aspects around it. If you were to zoom in from a private sector perspective, so what is it that industry should be doing to ensure that that there is a movement which is happening for adoption of more and more the industry 4.0, as currently many players continue to kind of get saddled with older technologies around it. So if the industry has to move to a faster adoption of the industry 4.0, what would be the few measures that the industry should take?
Yeah, so my view on this is that, okay, then there are greenfield projects where you start afresh and then you can actually build industry 4.0 in your business model itself. You adopt the technologies which are like world class, and you get the outcomes which are also world class. And then there are like brownfield projects. I mean, you already have a plant, you set it up some years back, and now just for industry 4.0 adoption, if the mandate is, or if the thought process is, objective is that, okay, I will adopt industry 4.0, most of the time it becomes overwhelming, because you see, I mean, you look at the investments that you need to make, your business model is structured in a particular way, and sometimes you get discouraged and that, okay, no, I mean, let us continue how we are. So my view is, and I've seen this in many of the projects that we've done, where we've helped through these technology deployment with customers who already have things, is first define the problem. You have a business model, what do you want to improve? And then take elements of the industry 4.0, which is the exponential technology you want to deploy. And then suddenly, when you link, the objective becomes solving the problem, making your outcomes better. It's easier to understand that, okay, this is a technology that works for me and this is what I develop. It's not that overwhelming then. Because sometimes when I first talk to industries, okay, why are you not going to the next level? I mean, they would say, why should I have 3D printing? I mean, why should I have this? But you don't need that. You need something else. What is the problem that you want to solve? Is your inventory a problem because you don't have connected systems? Is your spare parts a problem? What is your problem? When we come to these discussions, then suddenly the solutions emerge. And then the adoption becomes much more faster and much more impactful. So I just ask people that, okay, don't start with the objective that, okay, I have to adopt industry 4.0. I encourage people to start with, okay, these are the problems that I need to solve. These are the business objectives I need to make better. And then there is enough help around which can help you to say, okay, now if you deploy this technology in this order, then suddenly the digitalization strategy emerges, because it's then directly linked to your business model. So I would say that's something that we should focus on, making our productivity better. We should focus on making our outcomes world class. And I think then we will automatically get drawn to technology, because nothing else will get us to that world-class outcomes without the help of technology. So I think that is the approach that has worked with us and our customers in past.
Thanks, Alok. Sanjeev, if I may come to you, Alok said in a nice way that what is the problem that we're trying to solve? And in one of the areas, the problem is that you've got a larger share of MSMEs contributing to the nation's GDP as well. And we got a really large set of almost to the tune of 6.5 crore enterprises falling under that bracket. And government intends to increase their share as well. And these are always challenged with respect to the know-how, with respect to their balance sheet capability, as well in terms of investment that they can do. So how do you see that, and also there is a perspective that the MNCs are trying to tap into that market more and more as well, for fulfilling some of the requirements around it. So how do you see this as a more value-adding participation from MSME's perspective in the next 2 to 3 years, if you were to look at that time horizon?
So I can speak out of my experience that the MSME participation in the value chain is absolutely critical. For the simple reason that if I look at it from the MNC perspective, you bring best-in-class technology from global side, and only way you can compete is to localize it, and also only way to localize it, not to do it all in-house. You have to spread it through the MSME as well as the large-scale industries to help you to localize. And that I think is a factor of demand of your products and solutions. So as the demand rises in the country, you automatically have this spread of volumes to the MSMEs. So any category wherein we are dominant or we are having a strong presence, we find that our MSME partners are very stable, and because they also have a demand perspective from us, because we are serving the industry domestically and to some extent export. And then they are able to attract capital into their shop floors to make them more productive. I think that's how the cycle works. It doesn't work in isolation. It has to work with the scale as well as the stability of the market segment and the customers that you are serving. Now, when it comes to MSMEs, we do find that the incidence of MSME is not only in manufacturing. You always also have another category of MSMEs who are the integrators, wherein they take different pieces of technology, put it together, and then they supply to the machine builder or they supply to the manufacturing industry. And we find the incidences of both the machine builders who are in the MSME areas, the integrators, the incidence of them being available in tier 2, tier 3 cities is increasing. And then we find that as they reach the scale, they start investing, provided the buyer on the other side has a stable volumes for them and the stable payment terms. And government has assured that the payment terms for MSME is timely, so that they are not really at the credit risk of carrying the inventories on behalf of the large players. So from my perspective, I think MSME is going to grow as a natural factor. You can't catalyze it by anything. You have to grow the pie, and when then pie grows, that gets shared across to MSMEs, and as their volumes increase, they are able to invest more into more sophisticated plants and machinery. So as our GDP grows, we are at where we are. I think we allow a few more years and there will be a natural expansion of MSMEs alongside it. That's my view.
Sure. Kamal, if I may also ask you in terms of your views on the MSME sector, in terms of how the growth can happen and also their contribution can get enhanced more, from supporting the larger industry.
Yeah, I think first of all, completely agree with Sanjeev. I think MSMEs are critical to the growth of manufacturing in India, and I think that's going to be the way forward. But just to catalyze, so to say, how do we catalyze? How do we bring this? How can we accelerate the process? I think the key would be that government can support in getting anchor investors, anchor manufacturers in select areas. You can identify some 25, 30 sectors of economy where we know which are the large players, which could be the anchor manufacturers. And around that, you build a huge MSME infrastructure. And they not only bring in the demand, they bring in the capabilities, they bring in the knowledge, and we can upskill our entire MSME sector. So I think in completely echo what Sanjeev said. In addition to that, I think focus on anchor investors in 25 to 30 sectors of economy of manufacturing, which have already been identified. To my mind, that would be the way forward. Yeah.
And any example that you could give from your industry perspective from the auto sector, because there's a lot of MSME which are engaged in this area?
Absolutely. I think automotive industry is a very good example of anchor investors and developing a cluster of MSMEs around them. And if you look at various clusters which have been formed, whether it is Chennai cluster, Pune cluster, Bangalore cluster, one large manufacturer comes, whether it is, I don't want to name companies, but yeah, one large manufacturer comes, then you have a huge facility for glass, then you have wiring harness, and then you have machine components, you have foundries, you have so many world-class players which have in fact, automotive industry in India is a live example of high standards of performance which India has. I mean, we are pretty much very, very big when it comes to both in terms of quality and quantity when it comes to automotive sector. I think the place where we are lacking in the automotive sector is the ESDM or the electronic manufacturing. I think that is an area which will require large investments. That is the place where we will need government support, I think, and somebody spoke about, I think, Suvojoy talked about patient capital. I think these are some of the areas where we will need support, government support, where you don't see the returns immediately. It will take some time. That is where I think we need. So to cut the long story short, I think this has to be a partnership between industry, government, investors, the financial sector, all have to play a game of in this whole orchestra to really make things work together for the whole economy as such.
If I may complement Kamal's statement with an example, from the industry I come from, it's quite an easy process. If the government looks into the import list, what we import as an input to the industry, there are many categories we import and we don't have any local ecosystem. So give you an example, power electronics, for example. Power electronics goes into solar, inverter manufacturing. It goes into EV charging solution. It goes into the energy saving solution. But now what happens is the government can put risk capital there, as Sujoy mentioned, create a industry. So what you're doing is in one place, you are replacing a large import bill. And at the same time, you are creating a high-tech industry locally. And also with some support over a period of time, you will have enough depth and the confidence, and you benefit not only by using it for domestic industry, and also that sophistication plays out in how you play the global market. And there are several such categories which can be identified and is already available as the data within the system.
This will have a huge multiplier effect. I mean, once that this investment will likely pay for itself for several years and probably decades to come back. Yeah.
Sure. So we are kind of almost towards the end of our time, but Sujoy, I wanted to just quickly touch upon the skilling agenda as well. Given that when you contrast India's workforce with the workforces of more the developed nations around it, so when you see that almost 50% plus people in US would have got formal skill training. You look at Germany, Japan, the numbers go even higher than 75% over there. And contrasted to India, there is a much lower level of formal skill training available. What would be your thoughts in terms of, as we move towards this more IoT, AI, use of more technology intensive parts of it, from a reskilling perspective and from skilling efforts also, how does the government and academia should come together along with industry to make this a revolution?
Yeah, this has to go hand in hand. It's just, not enough just to say that, look, productivity needs to increase and IoT needs to come in, etc. So I think while, the fact remains that productivity needs to increase, there's still a huge number of people, large workforce and growing workforce in the country where opportunities need to be found. And that's also where our MSMEs, as was mentioned earlier, they provide a lot of employment opportunities in there. Now, of course, we've had these sector skill councils in multiple sectors. Some of them have had some success, others haven't had success. Our research into this area also indicates that the one difference is in some of the other countries, there is an uplift in the wage levels after skilling, right? That a person goes through certification, goes to a skill program, and then he or she sees an uplift in their wage levels. And that has not necessarily happened in India, that there's still enough of a demand for unskilled or low-skilled labor, and there's a supply of unskilled and low-skilled labor as well. Then somebody who is like an experienced welder or an electrician, they would say that, look, why would I invest a certain amount of money to go and get a skilling if my wages are not increasing? So for the manufacturing sector, therefore, it ties back to increased quality, increased productivity, and recognition of the skills. So the mechanisms are again there. I think the programs are all there. It is then tying it back to say that we make it worthwhile for the skilling part. So it doesn't just remain an input metric to say how many people have been upskilled, but actually then it's translating into the higher, the higher quality content of the jobs and eventually higher wage levels as well. I think that is the gap that, I don't have an answer how to solve for it, but I think here's where the bigger companies also need to take a lead to provide that. I think many companies are doing a lot in terms of investing into skilling programs. So again, supply is not an issue. I think one more point I just wanted to add on the MSME side before I close. I think our discussions with major MSMEs, two areas where there's still a gap. One is their ability to access technologies. And of course, MSMEs are not in a position to do R&D like the big companies. So it's largely through partnerships, and where there could be other MSMEs or larger companies with interesting technologies in Europe or Southeast Asia. They find it difficult to access technologies, get into joint ventures or technology transfer type of agreements. And the other area is to access export markets, because they say that we have a good product and we may be able to sell out. So we just don't know how. We just don't know. We can't set up an office in other countries. And this is again two areas where government can help. And there are good examples from Germany and Italy and Japan, where the MSME sector with a very focused kind of program to open up these two areas has really flourished. And this is something we can look at to help really, again, catalyze the growth in the MSME sector.
Thanks, Suvojoy, for that. Alok, if I come quickly to you in terms of your views on the MSME sector, as well as the related point to that we spoke about that how government could support some of the reskilling efforts around it. Is there also a requirement that there is some changes which are required to be done in terms of the standards which have been laid out by the government as well, which require revision, and that would kind of catalyze some of this movement to happen?
I agree with what Sanjeev said, that it's inevitable. I mean, MSMEs have become a very, very integral part of the industry, and it will only grow because that's a great model to have. As far as standards are concerned, a lot of work is happening by the government. I mean, BIS, in a partnership with a German agency, is adopting systematically the IEC standards. Like as an example, last year in August, we adopted the cybersecurity standard, which was a big ask for industry, because now that's the same standard which is across the world. And if the industry adopts that standard, I mean, we can work with anybody around the world and there won't be any cybersecurity concerns because it's the same standard throughout the world. So I think there is a lot of work happening. I think industry bodies can help the government to prioritize if there is any specific standard that is coming in the way. But what I have seen in the last 2-3 years is this partnership between BIS and one of the German agencies in working in conjunction with the IEC standards, I think is making this progress very intentional and also very productive. So I'm pretty happy with the way the government is bringing these standards to India and international standards to India, and not creating some other standards which makes it difficult then to compete and to collaborate.
So with this positive comments, if I were just to ask last question, again in the same order, if I may say, in terms of 3 things that you think would be required for India to increase its share of manufacturing in terms of the contribution that it has for GDP currently, from 15 to 17% that it is today to 25%. What would be those things that you would like to emphasize on? Kamal, starting with you.
I think the first is high precision, superior quality of high mix, low volume, smart products. I think that's going to be the future of manufacturing. It's going to be very mass customization, mass customization is going to be the future. I think ICT will be the future. If I see towards the end of this decade, they will lead to smart factories, green production is going to be the key. And last but not the least is, I think, very good support and ease of doing business and cost of doing business together with well-skilled people, upskilled current labor and the future labor which is coming in. I think these are some of the things which will drive India's share up.
Sanjeev, over to you.
So focus on a few very large-scale catalytical projects, which really makes a global statement, and that will bring the confidence of capital back into the country. And I think most of the programs are in place to do that. We are where we are. Don't expect overnight miracles. Manufacturing takes long time to set in a country. China has taken 25 years. And I think we should have that kind of a perspective and patience. Number two, on the skilling, we have the manpower and the young manpower the way it is and how educated and skilled it is. You can't again change it overnight, but use a lot of technology to make that the unskilled workers can participate in manufacturing. And just using the AI graphical modes, you can have a fairly unskilled person do a fairly good skilled work on the shop floor. Skilled workers are required when you don't have automation around them. When you have automation, you can have the participation. And most of the advantage in our country is that most of the people have a good intellect. Whether doesn't matter which a small city or large city you come, people are smart. If you give them an opportunity, they skill up. And you just make sure that the industry makes an automation module and package and meaningfully employ them. So it's on the job training as well as some internship. And last but not the least, youngsters are willing to take risk in terms of large scale manufacturing. I think government should think in terms of how to, kind of encourage the risk capital in certain industries, which can be transformative, or something which doesn't exist, some value chain doesn't exist in the country. We import a lot, put some risk capital and put some buffers around it. I think that can help us a lot as we go forward.
Wonderful. Alok?
Yeah, I'll say two things. One, localization of raw materials, especially the complex raw materials, whether it's the high-end forgings or it's the electronics chips. I think if we can enable that, a lot more manufacturing will be feasible in India than it is currently. That's one thing I would say. The second thing, as I mentioned, for exponential technologies to actually grow in any country, government, industry, and academia partnership in a meaningful way is very critical. So I think if we can enable these two things, everything else we have.
Wonderful. Suvojoy, if I may come to you.
Yeah, I think couple of next generation sunrise sectors, and India should now take the lead in some of that through quick assimilation of technology, some of these lighthouse projects, risk capital, and so on. And I think something like hydrogen or the next generation of vehicles, even in some areas like defense, where then it's not just for the domestic market but for export. We should do it with a view to be an export hub for some of these products. I think that's the approach, and that needs a very end-to-end value chain type of approach rather than picking only, say, power or logistics or ease of doing business. All those need to come together, but let's take an end-to-end value chain approach in a few areas and really scale it up.
Great. With such an illustrious panel, you can actually go on, and then get the insights from them. But every good thing has to come to an end. So with that, I will thank everyone for your participation around it. And if I may just say that, as a closing comments on it, there is some very good takeaways in terms of some of the insights that you mentioned in terms of, I think, aggregating the demand, from a government perspective, the focus on reducing risks. Sanjeev spoke about risk capital. That's an area that is a area of requirement and attention around it. the patient capital spoken about as well by Suvojoy. I think that also clearly comes in around it. And Alok did specify quite clearly from an MSCB point of view and also from an R&D perspective that we do have people, we do need those efforts to kind of continue around it, there. And if I may say that, from a ingredients perspective, all of us say that, that the government budget is supportive for some of these aspects on it. On the manufacturing side, we'll see how the story pans out, but it's not an overnight story. So we would look forward to that manufacturing moment getting really leveraged, by the government and by the industry and academia together, by their stronger partnership coming around that. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your time. Appreciate.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Welcome back. You're watching ET India Inc. Boardroom, brought to you in partnership with Transaction Next, powered by NPCI. One of the government's biggest initiatives has been Make in India. Add to that the potential shift away from China, and you have a tremendous opportunity for both making and assembling in India. But how ready is India Inc. to make the most of these opportunities, making and assembling? Our next fireside chat with an industry veteran explores this very subject.
Welcome everyone to ET India Inc. Boardroom series, and on this special edition on the theme of assembling versus make in India. With me today on the fireside chat is none other than Mr. R.C. Bhargava, Chairman of Maruti Suzuki India. Today we will focus on getting his views on assembling versus make in India, and of course his take on the union budget, what it means for the overall manufacturing industry, and in particular auto sector. If time permits, we'll also try and wind up with his take on the electric vehicles. But first, let me set a quick context for our chat. The Indian economy has displayed strong recovery from the pandemic's deep abyss, and interestingly faster than most predictions. After an estimated 7.7% contraction in 2021, India's real GDP is projected to record a growth of 11% in 21-22. As highlighted in the economic survey, the country is on a V-shaped recovery, as is being seen with several high-level indicators already. There is a conscious effort by the government to drive a supply-side reform push and ease of regulation, thereby offering greater certainty and clarity to domestic and foreign investors. A core focus on higher infrastructure investments, stronger manufacturing through production-linked incentive scheme, and credit availability seem to have revitalized the government's $5 trillion vision. In my view, this budget is an important milestone in some ways like the one that marked India's liberalization in 1991. Overall, it's a forward-looking, growth-centric, capacity-building, and debt-funded budget aimed at securing long-term economic growth and global competitiveness. The government has also prioritized an aggressive approach with some sizable investments in healthcare and infrastructure that carry a very high multiplier and also will help to ease the stress on the banking sector. The move towards providing a 35% rise in capex, divestments other than IDBI, strategic privatization of 2 banks and 1 general insurance company will not only add to the government revenue, but will also bring the required muscle power for sustained growth. It's a good budget and likely to open numerous opportunities for both domestic and foreign investors. On the domestic front, the budget also unveiled a significant rejig in basic custom duties to promote domestic manufacturing and help India become the part of the global value chain. The PLI scheme is undoubtedly expected to give much needed boost to the auto sector as well. It's a directional budget towards Atmanirbhar Bharat and focus on the fundamentals. With this, let me go over to Mr. Bhargava with my first question. Mr. Bhargava, COVID-19 has had varying degrees of impact across industries and companies. While one is hopeful of a sustained V-shaped recovery to drive domestic demand, how do you see the Indian manufacturing industry trending over the next 12 to 18 months? And what are also some of the areas that industry should focus on in terms of ease of business, sustainability, and innovation as it navigates through the pandemic?
You know, Indian manufacturing for decades has been operating at a growth rate of something around 6 to 8% a year. And I think we'll get back to that kind of growth rate. Probably by the end of this year, we will recover to the original levels of growth. But the real issue, Neeraj, is that a 6 to 8% growth is not enough. As the finance minister said in a budget speech this time, and it's the first time such a statement has been clearly made by the government. A double-digit growth in manufacturing is required if the $5 trillion economy target is to be met. And this was, of course, apparent even earlier, that without double-digit, and I would say in double digits, about mid-double-digit growth rates are required if India is to create enough jobs for its youth, if we are to create the kind of resources for the government which are required to implement the minimum social programs which are necessary in this country, and if India is to become a significant player in the export of manufactured goods from India. For all of that, something less than around 14-15% growth rate of manufacturing is not enough. And therefore, this recovery, as we talk about, recovery to the old rates, to my mind, is not enough. It's not just enough for us.
And what are the few aspects that you would like to stress on in terms of, that A, from the industry perspective, and B, from the government side of it, some measures the government has taken. Are there some, let's say, 3 or 4 measures which the government could take further in terms of, boosting this growth higher than, the one which we're expecting from an older rate perspective? And if I may also say that if you could nuance that with, the challenge the industry was facing pre-pandemic, because you said that the growth rates were 6 to 8%, which were not healthy enough there. So if you could just, give our views a little bit of a view on that as well.
See, prior to the pandemic, the reason why industry was not growing fast enough was several. But the most important among them was the fact that manufacturing in India was high cost, was not really competitive. And it was high cost because of the policies which have existed right from 1950, where the policies relating to industry were designed in a manner that those policies will result in creating resources from the industry for subsidizing goods and services to poorer sections of the population. Because this was the days of socialism when this started. And socialism meant that the poorer people had to be looked after, which is perfectly valid. But where I think we went wrong was in thinking that you could look after the poor people by increasing the cost of manufacturing and industrial activity in India. Because that made the costs of manufacturing high. We became less than competitive. It deterred foreign investors from coming into India. Higher costs of production, plus the higher taxations which were levied on a lot of items which were manufactured, again as part of socialism, resulted in the demand being kept down. And so if you have low demand and you have high costs of production, your growth rate is not going to be high at all. So in the period up to 1991, in any case, the private sector didn't have much of a role to play. It was largely public sector. And public sector, as you know, has never really managed the kind of growth cycle which industry would normally be expected to manage. They didn't generate internal resources. They were not required to make profits and so on and so forth. I don't want to go into that. But they did not lead to growth of industrial activity. After 1991, the private sector was still kept down from its growth because of the higher rates of taxation on manufactured goods, the higher costs of production, and the deterrence which these provided for foreign investors to set up manufacturing in India. So all of these have kept down our manufacturing to the kind of figures we have been talking about.
And in terms of, if you were to just add your perspective on the like a research and development aspect of it as well, compared to like global corporations and also larger corporations, the kind of spend which happens in India, on innovation and research part of it?
See, private sector till 1991 had no incentive at all to invest any money in R&D because you couldn't grow, there was no competition. So why would you waste money on trying to develop better products? After 1991 also, the requirement of doing R&D is that there should be a growth market, that you need to compete. And for most products, there is not much of a growth market. The size of the companies in India has remained small. And unless you generate enough internal resources, which after meeting the requirements of the shareholders and after meeting investment requirements and labor payments and things, you have surplus left, only then can you invest in R&D. And usually R&D is not possible unless the company is of a size which is adequate to provide internal resources, surplus internal resources, which can be put into R&D, because I don't believe it's wise to try and do R&D with borrowed funds. R&D has an element of risk in it. And to do R&D with borrowed funds, I think would be putting the company's future in great jeopardy.
And so Bhargava, so what you are kind of moving towards is that we had a low demand, we had the markets protected to a longer period of time, and then when we opened them up as well, the competition has not been adequate, and also the relatively smaller size of the companies has kind of created a kind of a vicious circle, wherein the companies are not able to plow back, the money that is required for R&D, and previously they didn't see the need itself, for doing it, or they were not forced, from a requirement perspective.
Correct. There's not enough compulsion on the companies because of competition. Because if there is strong competition, you will make all efforts to improve your products, reduce your costs, and do all of that. That has not happened here. And only a few sectors became competitive. You take the telecom section. It became highly competitive, and there was a lot of price reduction happening there, and the growth of the industry was high, and customer services improved. You take the automobile sector, with which of course I am connected, and there you've seen that a lot of competition developed over time, and that has led to products in India being of world class. But those are very limited sectors. In manufacturing, there are not too many sectors where you can say there was competition. What is also a fact is that foreign capital has come in a very, very limited manner into manufacturing. There's been a lot of direct foreign investment which has come into India and which is still coming into India, but it's not coming into hardcore manufacturing. It's coming into all kinds of technology, it's coming into pharmaceuticals, it's coming into all things of that kind. It's not coming into hardcore manufacturing. And there again, the problems are, in the last 4 or 5 years, ease of growing business has certainly increased. But the factors which fundamentally affected competition, and which, as you said in your introduction, this budget has started to address those factors. Public sector companies controlling infrastructure, controlling a lot of basic industries, but not producing at all to international levels of competitiveness. There have been a big drag on the competitiveness of the private sector after 1991. The public sector banks, because they were public sector banks and they had various social objectives to fulfill, it meant that the lending rates for the industry had to be raised so that they could fulfill their social objectives, do priority sector lending and that kind of thing. And still they were making losses, and which meant that government was periodically having to put money into these companies from tax resources. We ran a number of PSU companies, and we are still running them, which are making huge losses and which are a big drain on, again, the revenues of the country. All revenues which have could have gone into building infrastructure, building health, building education, has gone into subsidizing public sector. So the public sector, including public sector banks, public sector insurance companies, have actually been a big drag on growth of industry, growth of the economy, and competitiveness of industry. So fortunately for us, I hope this trend will continue. This budget clearly shows a reversal of those strategies. I think the finance minister has very clearly said that privatization is the goal, and the public sector will now become a very, very small and limited sector confined to maybe 4 strategic groups of industries and only 3 or 4 PSUs in each group. So I think that's a big step forward for the country.
So going forward, we see a much better, prospectively, if what's being planned, if it's put into execution, and the implementation pace. Are you concerned with the pace of implementation, or in terms of the fact that the divestment targets which we have set out and what we achieve, there has been a gap on those areas?
See, the divestment targets have mostly fallen short of what was set out. And I think the processes are such that it becomes very difficult, especially because there is a lot of, what should I say, hindsight examination of decisions taken by people who are involved in this. You had this case of some privatization of hotels, which was done about 15 years back, being open today, and people being accused now. You will not proceed with privatization if that remains the kind of... People today are worried that after they've retired, they may be hauled up and put into jail for something which they took in good faith at this time. So that's one factor. The second factor is that we have taken up a massive infrastructure program. Government's ability to implement projects, infrastructure projects primarily, including power stations and things, have always been less than adequate. The history of cost and time overruns is enormous. Every few months you see a report from the government itself which sets out how many projects are overrun and how the cost escalation has been another 100 and some thousand crores and things of that kind. I think that's another area which requires attention. And I think fundamentally it is this lack of trust in people. It is second-guessing decisions in hindsight. You can't do that. I mean, nobody will take decisions if somebody will sit back and after 5 years, 10 years, examine the decisions and say, this could have been done better. Most things could be done better if you look back on anything which is done. It's not that, and that is why, what the Japanese say, Kaizen. Kaizen means that everything is capable of improvement at all times, which means that if I'm doing something today, tomorrow the next guy can sometimes and usually will find ways of improving what I did. But it doesn't mean that what I did was the wrong thing. This improvement process is something which is ongoing and the things will continue. It's only if somebody is clearly acted in bad faith, has made money for himself, then you should prosecute him. But otherwise, I think the system needs to show much more trust in the officers, much more trust in the people taking decisions, and not have independent agencies of various kinds who are not at all aware of the pressures which people have when they take decisions to meet timelines and things like that. So I think this process needs to be improved, because otherwise this whole intention of speeding up infrastructure and things is going to get stuck badly. We will not meet our targets of disinvestment. We will not run our projects as well as we should.
Sure. So essentially, the focus should be to see that, while we are laying out a framework, from a year perspective there, but it has to be longer directional, perspective as well, giving us more predictability in terms of the policy and also in terms of the stability in terms of the taxation aspect of it as well. And then also looking at that the framework should be taking into care the perspective of how the implementation is also, and the people who are implementing it, have one, a guidance available, and B, in terms of subsequent a retrospective relook at some of these things is something that we should be avoiding to the max possible there.
Fundamentally, there has to be more trust, and people should not be called to account unless it's clearly established that they have taken personal benefit out of something.
Wonderful. Sure. So at this point in time, let me, Mr. Bhargav, zoom into the auto industry. There, given that as you saw, and you've been hearing also, that there is a lot of push that the government's doing, to the domestic manufacturing, and you did discuss some of the challenges that we face, from a pre-liberalization to post-liberalization era as well there. So I think in this budget specifically, the government kind of revisiting some of the custom duty across several products, including auto components as well. So this is likely to force companies in your industry to kind of reduce their import dependency on other countries, including China. And how do you see the industry responding to this?
The customs duty to reduce the import dependency is by itself not adequate. There are various reasons why people are importing what they import. Primarily, of course, they are importing because in most cases, that particular product is not available in India. Now, why it is not available in India can be for several reasons. Nobody is making it in India because technology is not available. Nobody is making it in India because the scale of demand in India is too small to make it economically. And it's no point doing import substitution if the locally made product is, let's say, 30% or 40% higher in cost than the product which you can import. Or if the quality is not up to the mark, to that make it acceptable to the customer. Because you don't want to lose competitiveness of a product merely because you want to say, I don't want to import. So one has to be careful how one does this. You look at semiconductors today. India has no semiconductor industry. What is the option for various kinds of manufacturers but to import the basic semiconductors from outside? And what is happening in India is that there's a lot of assembly work going on. You take the battery manufacture for electric vehicles. Nobody today has invested in India in making batteries on any scale. Suzuki has a project for making batteries, but those largely specialized batteries for hybrid vehicles. For normal EVs, there is no battery plant yet. China has a huge scale and huge capacities for this, so people are importing that. On the other hand, you do need customs duty production if a new unit does start for import substitution. And it's clear that this unit will take, let's say, 3 years or 4 years before it can attain the volumes of sale which will make it economic. to protect this unit and to enable it to reach at least youth from its birth, you need to give it some protection in the way of customs duties. So what I'm trying to say, Neeraj, is that the selection of customs duties for promoting local manufacture has to be very carefully and selectively done and used as a means of nurturing new domestic industry, so that that new domestic industry can mature and then become competitive on its own.
Correct, correct. So in terms of, if you were to like try and break it down in terms of, we do have PLI at the current time given out. We do have this combination of some of the custom duty coming in on some of the items, not on all of them around it. And then there is a general ease of doing business also, in some way with lesser focus on compliance or lesser burden on compliance rather, is coming through around it. So if you were to say that, deconstruct it a bit to say that which are the 3-4 measures, which if they are taken together, instead of maybe in a like an intermittent manner, would kind of create a very good, strong impact, for promoting domestic manufacturing?
I think the main thing which is required is that growth of consumption of manufactured products has to grow much faster. We started from the 6 to 8% growth of manufacturing industry. Now, if that 6 to 8% on the present base of manufactured goods in India could be stepped up to 12 to 15%, the volumes of demand which will be coming in and which people can forecast that, look, if I start a factory today, in 3 years' time, the total demand for the product will increase by 50% or 55%. Then I have a lot of confidence in putting up that investment. The foreign investor will also see that here is a market which is growing at 12 to 15%. And it has great scope for me to attain very good volumes and very good economies of scale, and maybe provide a platform for low-cost manufacturing for exports from India. So I think the key to a lot of this business of Make in India lies in creating an assured demand visible to investors in the future. Today, that is unfortunately not there. The demand picture, if people, you look at, again, let me get back to cars.
Sure.
The data for the growth of the car industry shows that over the last 10 years, the compound annual growth rate of car sales in India has declined from over 10% a year to 1.5% a year in the last 5 years. Now, that kind of figure is available to investors. Everybody knows this. Will they be enthused to make big investments in India on either car manufacture or even component manufacture? Because where will they see the demand coming from? And if they don't see long-term sustained demand, well, long-term meaning sustained demand for the next 5 to 10 years, why would they invest? So I think the starting point of all of this is create conditions in whichever industry you select. But overall, if you want to create the infrastructure for Make in India, then you have to create the demand for Make it in India products so that they become competitive in terms of quality and cost, which requires volume. The second part of it is the supply chain. No manufacturer makes 100% of any product himself. In the car industry, we buy out 70% round figure of the components from various suppliers. The supplier who's given me the component, the tier 1 supplier, has his own tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers. And the total number of people in the supply chain actually run into thousands. But all of them have to be of the same standard of quality and cost and competitiveness. Otherwise, my product will not be competitive either. And we run into a problem there because many of the small scale industries who form part of the supply chain do not have the resources in terms of capital, in terms then of equipment, in terms of manpower to create the environment for sustained quality manufacturing. They don't have the resources to do what we discussed earlier about R&D because they're just too small. In Japan, the small scale industries which provide components for the auto industry, and they are the tier 2 vendors, most of them are actually the people who have developed technology. But here are tier 2 vendors, even the tier 1 vendors are hardly able to develop technology. And we have, by treating people in the supply chain of modern industry in the same manner as other small scale industries, which could be retail shops, which could be repair shops, which could be oil mills, which could be wheat chakis, treating with all small scale industry, but treating them all under the same definition and with the same rules, I think has greatly hurt the supply chain development of India. And in that in turn has hurt the competitiveness of products, that has hurt the people coming in, because I know a lot of foreign investors are hesitant to come in India because of the difficulties of the supply chain.
Sure. So, and if we just extend it a bit, the PLI scheme that the government came up with from an auto components perspective, while the final details are yet to come on that, they did specify some of the threshold on the revenue side, 1,000 crore and investment of 350 crore over there. So while we just spoke about the fact that the resources and the availability, with the MSME sector, is a challenge for them to do further investments and come up with a cost competitive product. How do you read this? Is this limit set at a higher level, or this limit is at a lower level, which will lead to further, let's say, thinned out, program around this area?
I think small scale industries who form part of supply chains of manufacturing products should have a totally different definition of what a small scale industry is. It cannot be the same definition as a retail shop. It cannot be the same definition as a repair shop. It cannot be the same definition as localized industries catering to small communities. So I think we need to understand that, all these things are different kinds of creatures. And the supply chain components, by components I mean the manufacturing components of a supply chain, the small scale industries which form part of the supply chain, have to be treated understanding what the requirements of competitiveness are for an industry, and then to see that the rules are framed to encourage the company to achieve that standard of competitiveness. There should not be a barrier to that.
Sure. And if we just focus now a bit on the export growth potential, given that, from an India perspective, auto components and, from an auto sector as well, there is a certain degree of exports, which is happening and much larger than what was happening before. And at the same time, the cost of logistics, the impact of taxation on some of the matters, and then also in terms of some of the regulatory challenges, have been highlighted and also do remain as well in that. In that context, if the the auto industry needs to get much more integrated with the external network, for that to happen, will the auto suppliers need to kind of scale up their global footprint, also integrate with larger network that the OEMs have, and like you rightly brought it out earlier also, that we need to be globally competitive from a cost perspective, there. So what would be some of the priority areas that you believe that the industry should be adopting to kind of expedite this integration process?
See, the fact is that we do export a pretty large amount of auto components. And if you read reports of ACMA and others, we all pride ourselves that, see, our exports have grown from 0 to $11 billion or something like that. $11 billion sounds a lot of money. But the reality is that exports of auto components from India are about 1.5% of the global trade in auto components. And if you look at it in that perspective, it tells you that we are doing virtually absolute less than peanuts. And that is the reason, but the reason again is the same as what we've been discussing. Our industry is not either competitive in terms of quality, cost maybe, but quality no. And we are not competitive in our ability to develop technology. And unless you are globally competitive in terms of quality, and I mean consistent quality, and which you can only do if your tier 2 and tier 3 vendors are also globally competitive in terms of consistent quality and of course cost. And there is technological capabilities in the country and amongst the manufacturers to keep developing new products as the customer wants abroad. You will not become exporter of auto components where you have, let's say, 10% of the global market. And we should have. We have the capability of having that kind of a market, but we don't have it.
And to some extent,
again, scale of operations and conditions for these companies to actually achieve. But there is one other factor. The entrepreneurs themselves have a lot of role to play in this. And I think, and this has been my sort of favorite hobby horse for a long time, I think in India, the Western style of management is inappropriate. And I think Indian management needs to learn a lot more from the Eastern countries in terms of management systems and how they manage. Because the Western style of management is no more competitive in manufacturing industry. Manufacturing industry has almost died out for a large spectrum of manufacturing in all the Western countries. Today, US is trying to get jobs back, but it's not really going to succeed in doing it. And more auto components, again, we're talking of, is outsourced. China has become a huge supplier of auto components. Korea is a supplier of auto components because costs and quality and technology all exist there. In India, I think our entrepreneurs, our managers, our promoters have all to understand the absolute benefits which they will get if they can create teamwork and maximize the resources of the company to create the bandwidth to improve quality, improve productivity, reduce cost.
You bring a very interesting comparison and insight, between the Western and the Eastern, ways of managing aspect of it. It'll be nice if we can, if you could just highlight, let's say, 2 or 3 clear contrasts that you see, and if adapting to the Indian environment, because I mean, Maruti, where you've been, at the helm of affairs for such a long time. And there's an ecosystem which Maruti, when it came in, developed, with the vendor partnerships that were done, in supporting them with quality and, some of the other measures that were taken. is there when you look on a go-forward basis, we just started the decade, with 2021 now, given the pandemic behind us to a large extent, there. How do you see that, the 2-3 areas, where the Eastern style of management still holds much greater value and strength for the industry?
See, by Eastern, I'm primarily talking of Japan. And the main point I think I would like to make is not that Japanese did something which is very unique to them. But if you do a little thinking, today it's a competitive world. There are very few barriers to international trade today. And what makes an industry grow? Ability to be competitive. Now, workers in an industry, how do they prosper? Is it by having strong unions and fighting with the management and occasionally going on strike? Or, which of course will all not help the growth and productivity of the company? Or is it by becoming partners with the management and working to maximize the competitiveness of the company and then sharing some of the benefits which come from growth and profitability because you are more competitive? I think the answer is clear that the job security of the worker is best ensured if the company is competitive and therefore is not under any threat of being wound up because it's going bankrupt. The ability of the company to provide benefits to the workers, whether it's in terms of salaries or perks or housing or schooling or any other thing, is only if the company generates the resources. And I think the workers have realized, at least in Maruti, we could make them realize right in the early 80s, that their best option was to maximize Maruti's productivity and Maruti's profitability, because then we could share some of that with them. The point is, of course, that the management should be willing to share part of the gains of better productivity and better profitability with the workers. And if you do that, and if the workers see that their efforts to improve the company lead to some gains for them also, and that the management is actually concerned about looking after the interests of the workers along with their own interests, then I think things become different. The Western style is where you have huge differences between the income levels of the workers and the management. And there is no attempt made to persuade the workers to join in growing the company. It's not taken as a role of the management that you have to win the confidence of the workers and persuade him that, look, and teach him that, look, the best option for you is to actually work with us and jointly create a good company. So that teamwork aspect is what I think distinguishes the Japanese management. How to create teamwork. How to create teamwork in the political and social environment which you have. I think that's what each management has to think of. The same approach we followed with vendors. Ultimately, vendors were being set up for Maruti because there was nobody else in the field. They were largely dependent on us for business. Was it not absolutely clear that their growth and our growth was totally interlinked? If we did well, they would do well. If we failed, they would fail. There was this huge interdependence between us. It is not a situation of, buyer, seller, and my trying to squeeze them out, and they're trying to maximize their price from me, because that's not the object. The object is to maximize the growth of the company. The more Maruti grows, more the vendors will grow, which is what happened. And so we adopted this approach of working as partners. Now, why this is not understood by industry as a whole, I don't quite fathom. Because it's clear to everybody, to me, is that vendors, suppliers, and the industry have to go hand in hand. Their futures are interlinked. Why they should not help each other, I don't understand. We decided that it was in our interest to give vendors all kinds of help, including technical help, management help, administrative help, to improve. And our programs of improving vendor quality and vendor productivity and all of that, we have spent a lot of money on that. That's all paid back.
You make it sound so easy, Mr. Bhargava, the way, because you've done it, and it's been proven as well.
It is actually not difficult. But you have to understand that that is the way to go. If you say that, no, I'm the buyer and I'm the boss, and these guys are just suppliers, and they have to therefore listen to whatever I say, it doesn't work.
No, truly. I mean, I think while the interpretation is that they are at an opposing forces, to see that that you are able to buy something at a lower and lower cost around it, and of course get the quality that you want. But like you said, with the partnership framework coming in, you can achieve both with a higher scale and demand, which would come in.
In India, many of your suppliers don't know how to improve quality because we had access to Japanese technology. We could help them improve quality. We could help them improve productivity. But
correct,
their improved productivity and quality ultimately benefited whom? Of course, they made profit, but so did I. So I'm not unhappy if both of us win.
That's right. So there's a strong message for the industry, in that, with the proven track record and performance as well, and also the benefits which have been there for all the constituents in terms of employee, company, as well as the vendor system as well there. Mr. Bhargava, I'm sure we are running out of time, but may I, if you have 5 minutes, and I just wanted to kind of touch upon the EV part of it as well. Would that be all right?
Sure.
Okay. Just as the last question, electric vehicles, both from the perspective of environment and also from the priority for the government as well, and policies like FAME 2 have provided significant opportunities to both domestic and the foreign players around it. If you were to look at them and say that what's in our view would be that some of the key tax compliance and incentives related aspects that the government should focus on in making the sector, as we've been talking, globally competitive. There seems to be like a huge demand which is untapped and just waiting to get deployed.
First, fundamentally, I believe subsidies should be used only if ultimately that product is going to be competitive, and subsidies are only for a limited period. You cannot make a product grow in large volumes on the basis of subsidies. It must stand on its own feet. The problem today in India is that there are a number of problems actually, but let me name 2 or 3 of them. The first problem is that technology for batteries today, it was not, what should I say, it was believed 2 or 3 years ago that the cost of battery technology would develop and battery costs would come down drastically in 3 years' time. At that time, batteries were about $200 or something per kilowatt hour. And it was thought that 3 years later, it'll come down to around $70 or something per kilowatt hour. It's not happened. Technology has not developed as was expected. And there is no clarity even now, at least I don't have any clarity as to how battery technology and when battery technology will come to a level where the EVs can be affordable for small car holders, small car owners. Because in a small car, the cost of electrification becomes a major part of the cost of the car. In large cars, it is a comparatively smaller percentage of the cost of the car. And India is over 70% small cars. So if you electrify cars in India, at this point of time, it's only a small number of bigger cars which can possibly be electrified, and the market is very limited. The second issue, if you really are looking for large-scale electrification of cars in India, is that the lithium material, which is the basic raw material for batteries, is controlled by one country to the extent of almost, I think, around 80% of the sources of lithium are controlled by one country. And there is therefore a strategic issue in my mind as to whether India should become dependent on such a fundamentally important raw material as lithium for today's technology on sources which are controlled by one country. It's a question which I think is a large macro question for countries' energy security, which needs to be looked at. There is, of course, the cost of infrastructure. I believe that at the moment there is an option also which is being explored in many countries in the world of hydrogen as a source of fuel for clean energy and clean mobility. And for countries which have this large dependency on the material in terms of, technology for batteries may change and something else may develop, I don't know. If that happens, we have to reevaluate again. But otherwise, hydrogen has many attractions because on that it's absolutely clean and you're not dependent on a diminishing raw material. And as the Prime Minister said, just I think it was yesterday, that for the next decade, India should move to the gas economy. I am totally in agreement with what he says. I think because we are a small car country, I think in the next decade, we should maximize the use of CNG, biogas, whatever alternative fuels are available for reducing oil import, for improving the environment. And during this period, see how technology develops for electric cars and hydrogen cars, and then take a decision. Because we can afford this 10-year period because gas is a good intermediate solution to bridge this period from now till technology is more stable and more known as to what it is going to be. I don't think we should rush into this. Yes, electric vehicles are probably required for two-wheelers because there the gas option does not exist. But for cars and for CVs has an option of liquid petroleum gas, liquid natural gas. So those options should be explored for the next decade. And I think if we have to do EVs, we should then only try and develop EVs for the two-wheeler industry.
Great, Mr. Bhargava. I mean, thank you very much for a discussion on wide-ranging discussion and really insightful and helpful around it. Some really interesting takeaways for all of us as well as we go back with some fresh perspectives. We did discuss in terms of I think if I try and jog a little bit in terms of I think the focus that you stressed on that we have to boost the demand there. And the growth that we're having, like 6 to 8% on the manufacturing side of it, while we will get that by the end of the year, but that is something which is not adequate, and we need to boost it up, to double it up effectively to almost 12 to 15%, and that would enable a kind of a cascading effect, where there would be demand coming in and more of a assured demand rather to the investors, and lead to a more stronger capex cycle as well. There, I think your point around the fact that the enabling system needs to get created for the MSME sector by changing the definition, relooking at some of the way they are classified today, and also the support that they need to kind of boost the skill development, innovation that they're looking at is also a critical element, as part of the discussion that we did. And I think the point which you mentioned on the industry needs to probably look at it from the side of say that which are the management styles and practices, which they have been practicing so far. How's the response to them has been for the different stakeholders which are part of the journey, and are there learnings which are there, which you also enumerated, from an Eastern management style, which something could be put into practice and lead to a betterment, for all the stakeholders, and create a more win-win situation, for everyone around it. I think the point on the electric vehicles is certainly critical, and I think you do bring about a very a fresh perspective, a strong insight into the fact that there is still a lag between the technology development, and we could bridge that, with the focus coming in on some of the gas based vehicles as well, while we continue our efforts on the electrical vehicle side of it. I think thank you very much for the time. Clearly the budget has also focused a lot on fiscal prudence during the current perspective on that. So we do have a much needed booster shot for our economy, hoping for a sustained V-shaped recovery. The government has shown its lot of intent in the budget, but as it happens, the real litmus test would be in its implementation. And for the auto sector, as we discussed, there is a significant potential to grab a much larger share of the world trade. You just mentioned 1.5%. I mean, it's, as you rightly said, it's peanuts than what we are doing right now. So we're just probably just peeling away the onion at the surface. So the success of the scheme would depend on its specifics and how it will work on the ground there. So with that, once again, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Neeraj. It's been enjoyable talking to you. Thank you.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to the end of today's edition of the ET India Inc. Boardroom, brought to you in partnership with Transaction Next, powered by NPCI. If you'd like to watch any of today's or previous sessions, simply log on to etboardroom.com. This is me, Suresh Venkat, signing off.